I don't know where else to share my story, so I've just come here to the first website that pops up when you search at Goatman. I don't really care where I post it. The only thing that matters is that it's posted. My name is Richard, but if you don't mind me doing so, I'd prefer to skip the pleasantries and proceed with my needed story. I first came to know the tale of this frightful creature around a year ago during a school expedition that took us hiking through some desolate forest somewhere in rural England. The trip was actually completely normal, and nothing disturbing happened whatsoever. But as we sat down at the campfire one night, one of the students, whose name I didn't know, suggested that we tell some scary stories around the campfire. As cliché as it sounded, we all agreed and decided to take turns. The student who came up with the idea stated that they would go first, as they had a pretty good story saved up for such moments as this. They told a tale of a humanoid creature that, for the most part, possessed a body of a human, but that it had the head and legs of a goat. Naturally, it was labeled as the Goatman, and the student went on to speak of the creature and its endeavors into the awful. This story is the only one I remember from that night, with the rest of the stories all being based around the same generic plot concerning a bloodthirsty creature who was on the hunt for human flesh. Easily forgettable, to say the least. What scared me about the story of the Goatman and successfully imprinted into my memory was that it supposedly didn't kill people, or rather it didn't kill them straight away. The Goatman could shapeshift into any creature, be that a person or an animal. It didn't even need some ritualistic such as a drop of blood or anything crazy. It could just transform at will. I vividly remember the student ending his tale by reminding us once more that the Goatman preferred to mentally exhaust its prey before ending their lives in a variety of unimaginable, gruesome ways. Although it would very rarely show itself in its true form, the student said. Victims would typically see it take dozens of appearances throughout very short time periods. This tale was slowly but surely pushed to the back of my mind over the next couple months, with me sitting important exams and entering a transition period where many students would leave my school in order to pursue their studies elsewhere, being replaced by a more optimistic bunch who were so happy throughout their first few days at school that it made the rest of us uncomfortable. You can relax though. They weren't brain-eating aliens sent from another planet to destroy the human race, and their blissful mood soon vanished, being replaced with a harsher, more realistic one that suited the repetitive nature of school life. During this transitionary period, a number of people I knew left the school, with some of my close friends throwing goodbye parties with other people, such as the student who first introduced me to the tale of the Goatman, practically vanishing. The story of the Goatman was forcefully reintroduced to me today during a trip I made to the National Art Gallery with a small group consisting of my two closest friends. We made our way through the various sections of the gallery over the course of a couple hours, but weird and seemingly unexplainable things would occasionally happen to the group of us. The most alarming of these things was most certainly when I witnessed firsthand my friend James exiting the room containing sunflowers through a door located on the right side of the room, before reappearing through the door on the opposite side of the room only moments later. This feat was clearly impossible due to the way the building was laid out, but when the remaining two of us started walking towards James and questioning how he had just done that, he quickly backed out of the door without uttering a word. We concluded this was a practical joke, but before we could exit the room after, James, he shouted to us from the right-hand side of the room that he had initially exited out of. He yelled, "You guys coming or not?" and was seemingly clueless when we caught up to him and questioned him about the events that had just transpired. I was somewhat shaken by this initially, but refused to accept that it could have been anything but a joke. Whilst this was the only largely creepy thing that had occurred within the gallery, with the only other noticeable occurrences being a few people smiling at us in creepy ways, and one woman who supposedly walked up to my friend Charlotte and began talking to her in a language Charlotte can only describe as cryptic. Things only got worse once we decided to depart. As we drove back to our town, I stared out the window and dozed off, suddenly awakening out of nowhere as the car stood stationary at some traffic lights. Rubbing my eyes, I gazed out of the window once again, but was jolted awake when I saw the kid who had first told me the story of the Goatman all those months ago, staring at me from the other side of the road. He had an eerie grin on his face, but in true horror movie fashion. I did the stupidest thing imaginable and opened the car door before running up to him and smiling back. Fully prepared to catch up with him and asked where he'd been. I hadn't thought about the Goatman so far that day, up until I saw the boy from the hiking trip standing there, and looking back on it, I'm pretty sure that the Goatman knew this too. He wasn't willing to let me forget. Just before I made it to the other side of the road, a car came speeding out of nowhere, passed right in front of me, missing me by mere inches. I flinched and impulsively clenched my eyes shut, only opening them when I sensed the danger had passed. I almost jumped out of my skin when I focused on where the boy whose name I didn't know had been standing only come face to face with an elderly man, who, despite his drastically changed features, wore the same creepy smile. I turned and sprinted back to the car, where my three friends had observed the entire event. I knew I couldn't have been hallucinating when I saw the looks of abject terror etched across their faces. I jumped in, closed the door behind me, and James slammed his foot down on the gas. The four of us sat in silence, with the only conversation we had occurring when James attempted to pull into his driveway before Charlotte shouted at him to turn their car around and head towards the nearest police station. He began to question her, but she cut him off, and the desperation in her voice told us that something was very wrong. James kept his eyes on the road as he drove towards the station, and Charlotte looked out the window as she sat next to him, occasionally catching my gaze as she glanced back in my direction, a look of unwavering concern overshadowing her usually calm demeanor. We eventually reached the police station, and I got out of the car. We reached the door to the station before Charlotte grabbed me and twisted me around, forcing me to look back at the car. I caught a glimpse of a figure dragging its leg behind it as it shuffled off in the other direction, features indistinguishable in the cover of the night. "What?" I asked her as I observed the figure, somewhat rationally assuming it was somebody departing from the police station after having been interviewed regarding an injury for their leg. "Richard," she whispered to me, voice evidently close to giving out and with tears in her eyes. "That thing, it was in the car with us. Did you somehow not notice it? There were 3 of us in the car when you arrived and began to leave the gallery. But a while after you got back, I caught sight of it. It was sitting next to you in the back. I was watching it from the wing mirror in the car, and it just sat there, smiling at you for the entire journey with this horrible, indiscernible smile." Her voice trailed off as she finished her sentence, and I was left more terrified than I'd ever been in my entire life. There was no way I couldn't go an entire hour-long car journey without noticing somebody sitting next to me. It was impossible, and I knew it. Yet it had happened. My feet gave out from the sheer panic I was experiencing, and I collapsed to the floor with an audible thud. Now, my eyes were filling up with tears too, but I swear I saw the silhouette in the distance turn around to look at me one final time before shuffling off into the night. The police heard us out, but took no action, as all we really had to talk about was a couple of people smiling at us creepily and an account of somebody slipping into our car, having been noticed by the person who sat in the passenger seat in front, and yet somehow evading the sight of James and myself, despite supposedly staring at me for the entire journey. I explained to them the story of my hiking trip and of the Goatman, but it was met with raised eyebrows despite my pleading and protesting. By this point, I would have started questioning my own sanity had I not been sitting next to 2 others who had shared this horrific experience with me. Eventually, the police said they'd come and visit each of our houses the following morning for more information after we had slept, and that we should call them if anything else out of the ordinary happened. They escorted each of us home, and we decided to reconvey the following day at James's house in order to try and piece together what had happened over the course of the day. I was the last to be dropped off, and the officer who was driving the squad car told me that they'd keep a unit on standby throughout the night, and then it would be dispatched to my address immediately should I dial the emergency services. He flashed me a smile as he rolled up the window of his car, and I froze momentarily before shrugging it off. I was able to muster a faint laugh as I looked at my predicament, with me now being so paranoid that I was coming within inches of a heart attack whenever somebody did so much as smile in my direction. However, my fears were very reasonable, and maybe, just maybe, I was correct to have been scared by his smile. I dare not look back as I made the long walk up my driveway and into my house, being so sure to lock and bolt the door behind me before searching the entire house for any open windows. Every window in the house was closed, but that didn't stop me from locking them too. I tried sleeping in my room with the lights on, but I found that my mind refused to rest, instead desired to wander. I came up with endless explanations, but there was one so terrifying that I was forced to get out of my bed and roam around the house, keeping any suspicious movement going on outside. Perhaps it should have been obvious to me earlier, but I'd had so much going through my head that I'd only just come to the realization that I'd never seen the boy who told me about the Goatman and appeared to be on my side of the road, anywhere apart from on that hiking trip. Desperate to be proven incorrect, I grabbed my yearbook and began frantically tearing out the pages. Minutes later, I was a sobbing mess, having gone through the entire yearbook but not found a single person resembling him. Now it was clear to me. The Goatman himself was the one who had told me the tale of the Goatman, and the boy he was capable of shapeshifting into must have been a past victim, or something along those lines, seeing as I'd never seen him in my life before or after the night where he first told us the story. At least, that was the case, up until today. As I'm writing this, I'm sitting at the table in my living room. I have all the doors locked and windows bolted, with a piece of furniture propped up against each one to prevent anyone or anything from entering. I also have the radio on loud to drown out all the sounds emanating from upstairs, those being the occasional creaking of the floorboards and other noises which I cannot identify. To be fair, I do live in a very old house, so perhaps those sounds can be rationalized. I have my mobile next to me, just one tap away from calling the police. It's 8 p.m., and that means my parents should get home from their evening out in around 2 hours. I'll just sit tight until then, staring out the window into my garden. Thankfully, nothing can get into my house without walking up the drive and passing through the well-lit front garden first, so I'll be able to call the police immediately if anything or anyone who I don't recognize starts approaching. My dog is lying flat on the floor a couple of meters from me, staring up at me with a vacant expression. I think it can sense fear. Nothing can get into my house without making an awful amount of noise. I know that now. I will have time to flee and call the police on my mobile before anything bad happens to me. You see, there's just one problem that I blatantly ignored during my overanalysis of the situation. My parents took our dog with them on their trip. Whatever is currently lying meters away from me on the kitchen floor knows it cannot possibly be my dog, and as it begins to convulse, I fear it's realized that I've just come to the same conclusion. I'm a bit of an occultist. This is important later, and I went through a phase as a teenager where I studied almost everything paranormal I could get my hands on. But these days, I'm mostly a skeptic where spectacular creature phenomena are concerned. Or I was, until about 3 days ago. Around that time, I was on a drive and I heard a really old podcast about black-eyed kids. The original internet post from Alabine, and I almost wrecked my truck. The story was so similar to an experience that I had with my boyfriend back in January. But let me tell you about that first, because it's weird in and of itself. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a date with my boyfriend. It was actually our first date, despite having met online over a year ago, and being an official couple for 4 months at that point. We decided to drive down to Baton Rouge for the weekend after a college football national championship, so partying was in full swing, from the LSU victory to party and hang out in general. Our first night there, we decided to see a movie. I think it might have been the 1917 movie, and we got to the theater about an hour early so we could make sure we got good seats. We got our tickets, and having time to kill, we decided to walk across the street to the Mall of Louisiana and take a quick look around and window shop for our planned outing the next day. It was kind of late, around 7:30 or so most of the shops were closed, but we decided to go to the mall anyway. Like I said, to window shop, and also to walk around and stretch our legs. We had just crossed the street at the crosswalk right there between the theater and the bowling alley and arcade, and it happened. I never saw them walk up, which is odd, because I have a really hyper-focused sense of observation. I grew up in a bad environment, and you learn early to take note of everyone and everything, no matter if you think somebody is a threat or not, just in case. Me and my boyfriend, who is younger than me, and also a slim individual, had just made it to the other side of the street when two boys approached us, seemingly out of nowhere. One looked to be about 16, and the other was about 12 or 13. Both of them were Caucasian in appearance, the older one having either brown or sandy blonde hair, and the younger one with brown hair. It was just light enough outside still to be able to see that much. My first impression was that their clothes were weird. They looked like the kind of Abercrombie and Hollister clothes a typical suburban kid would wear, but from the mid-90s, kind of faded almost. The older boy started talking, and it immediately creeped me out. "Do you have a car?" He just walked up to me and asked that. But I'm a nice guy, and other than the weird feeling that something was off, and despite it being such an odd question, I decided to answer. Bear in mind that at this point, my boyfriend is beside me and slightly behind to my left because he was following me and we had been talking. We had both stopped talking because of how weird we both felt in this situation. This is really hard for me to type. I'm honestly creeped out and scared at the present moment, but I want to put my whole story out there. I looked at my boyfriend, and he had his head down and had moved behind me. I'm a bigger guy because I used to work out heavily before my job took over, and I could tell he was getting behind me because he was scared. And my boyfriend doesn't scare easily. He's never backed down from a fight, and his headstrong nature has gotten him into trouble before. But now he was hiding behind me, and when he saw me looking at him, he raised his head and shook his head no before putting his head back down. He also wasn't on his phone, which was weird because he had just been in the middle of a lively Snapchat conversation moments earlier, that being his preferred social media app. I looked back at the boys, and neither of them had moved. I don't know why I said it, because my first instinct was to lie and get my boyfriend away from there. But I told him, well, not really. I mean, I have a rental. I'm parked over there. I pointed to the movie theater parking lot. Can you give us a ride? Despite the complete sense of uneasiness I had, and the extremely strong sense that they did not need to be anywhere near my car, I was curious. I've been a youth pastor and youth addiction counselor in the past, so when I see a kid in need, my first instinct is always to try and figure out what's going on and how to help. Where do you need to go? We came to the mall, but we need to get back to our house. It's not far from here. Our parents will be mad if we don't get back. Well, why don't you call them? Maybe they can give you a ride. I was headset against giving them a ride, despite their average appearance. I kept getting images of maniacal smiles and throats being slit from behind in the back of my mind. We don't have phones. I have a habit of scanning my surroundings, and I looked up just then to see if the other people milling around were just trying to get past us on the sidewalk, or looking at the strange conversation of young men in the middle of a busy throwaway. But just as I looked up, I heard the younger one say, "They're not paying attention." Heard him say, I never saw him speak, despite having him stand not 3 feet from me, and his face being very much in my field of vision. I also thought he was speaking to his brother. His brother looked at him, and I heard, "They can help us." The younger one looked back at him. "They can see us." I thought this was odd, but I was more concerned with finding a polite end to this conversation and seeing these boys on their way safely. I really would help you, but there's all kinds of stuff in my back seat, and we have to see a movie soon. It won't take long. It's not far. The older one had spoken and turned to face me again. I barely managed to notice that the rest of the small crowd at the mall looked kind of washed out. Almost not there, really, when I saw his eyes for the first time. They were the palest shade of green. Yes, odd for a black-eyed kid story, but bear with me. His eyes, though I could see them, were kind of ethereal. Almost not really there, almost transparent, like ghost eyes. They had bits of yellow in them. Maybe they turned blue. I'm not sure. They were hypnotizing, though. I noticed fear in his eyes. Not, I'm about to die fear, but I need serious help fear. The fear a kidnapped victim might feel, or a lost kid. He looked at the younger boy again. Yeah, he can see us. Ask him for help. I was sketched out by now, and I just wanted to leave. I can't give you a ride, but you said it's not far. Can you walk? Or can I let you use my phone to call your parents? They're not at home. They're still at work. It's too far to walk. It's a couple of miles. I was desperate to get away by now. The sense of urgency to help was getting far too strong, and I didn't like it, because every time I thought about helping, I got a stronger sense that I was going to be murdered. I just knew that if I survived the trip there, I would be invited in, and I wouldn't be able to refuse, and their parents would be inside, and it would be bad. My boyfriend wasn't even a thought then, except that he was so close behind me that I could feel his presence. We had to go. I can maybe give you a couple of dollars for bus fare. There was a bus stop right there. We just moved here. We don't know the bus stops. We just need a ride. Where are you from? Far away. Look, I wish I could help you, but we've got to go. And with that, I started to walk away and made sure my boyfriend was with me. We left that spot in a hurry. I turned around about 5 seconds later to look at the two weirdos, and they were gone. My boyfriend was pissed. I can't believe you did that. Did what? Talk to them. What? They needed help. They were messed up. What, you mean high? Their pupils weren't even dilated. No, they didn't have any pupils. They were messed up. I didn't see anything. I can't believe you didn't see anything. I'm telling you, they were messed up. That's why I didn't say anything, and I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I believed him, kind of. I thought he meant drugs. I joked with him about it for a few moments, honestly not seeing anything amiss, except for their weird attitude and the insistence of getting in my car, but he got even more upset. Just stop talking about it. I'm done. I'm not crazy. And so I dropped it, until 3 days ago, when I heard a story about black-eyed kids on an old podcast show I had recently discovered. I called up my boyfriend to ask him, those guys at the mall back in January, did they have black eyes? Yeah, was all he would say. He was still too scared to talk about it. But looking back, I remember that weekend. It was bad. Me and my boyfriend argued about trivial stuff. We almost broke up. He developed a nosebleed that night after he went to bed. I almost went crazy. I drove across town, full of unexplainable angst, and stopped at one of the riverboat casinos. Out on the promenade, I had this strong urge to throw myself in the Mississippi and drown myself. It was raining, and the water looked rough. I knew I wouldn't survive, but somehow, I held back against the unexplainable urge. In the weeks that followed, he had a near nervous collapse. I was having issues at work that almost cost me my job. We almost broke up again. I had a psychic help me do a cleansing, and things which had slowly begun spiraling into an abyss, especially with virus-related layoffs, started improving. Now, I mentioned to you that I was into the occult, since I'm a pagan. Well, yesterday, I was talking to a witch friend of mine who has a lot of lore knowledge and experience dealing with the paranormal. A lot more than me. I told her my story, and she was not the least bit surprised. Yeah, she told me, they're the spirits of kids who were horribly abused in life. I thought about it and considered the Scandinavian Mylings. Children with black eyes come back for revenge on the living, killed at a young age and denied a proper burial. Then I thought about another black-eyed kid story, where the parents of the kids actually did drive after a lady invited them, which brings me to a second story. I was staying with some friends of mine once, and this was actually about the same time I had met my first boyfriend online. Anyway, they were a couple, and we were all close. I'll just leave it at that. They had a son whom I'll call Robbie, not his real name. Anyway, Robbie was the coolest kid ever. He was 7, got good grades at school, and was fiercely independent. Knew how to cook a little bit, did chores like chopped firewood, and was known to steal alcohol on occasion. Then, he had a side of his personality where all he wanted to do was either snuggle up to me or his mom on the couch and watch a cartoon and fall asleep on the days where it was raining and he did not have school. Mom worked weekends and didn't, and Dad wasn't the affectionate type. And, like I said, we were all close. He called me uncle. Anyways, he was a sweet but tough kid. Well, one time, he started having nightmares and sleepwalking, which is typical 7-year-old kid stuff. No big deal. I don't remember the nightmares because they were eclipsed by something else. The spirit. We would all go to another friend's house for the day and come back, and the front door would open. At first, we thought the 2 puppies did it. They were 6 months old, black labs, and could be rambunctious. So we put the dogs outside when we left, and the door would be open when we got back. We called the police eventually, after about a week of it, and they set a patrol for the area. The door started staying shut, but the inside doors would all be reversed. Doors that were closed would be opened and vice versa. We were getting freaked out. A couple of times, Mom would swear she had heard somebody on the porch outside here, bedroom window. We were in a double-wide trailer with a porch that ran the length of the whole thing. Once, I thought I saw a small figure run past the living room window, but I did not hear footsteps, and there weren't any prints in the sand of grass around the porch. We all looked. This all came to a head that night, asleep on the couch. I bolted awake when the dogs growled. The dogs never growled. They were too scared to chase a frog. Innocent little puppies. The growling set me on edge, and I woke up, alarmed. And there was a dark man's shape trying to get through the front door. The dogs ran from the kitchen and tried to attack it. I'm a brave guy. I've run into burning buildings, jumped into a snake-infested creek to grab a kid who couldn't swim. But this, I screamed. The whole house came running. At first, they didn't believe me. The figure had disappeared. They thought the dogs were play fighting and just happened to hit the door. But the door was locked, every night, and I pointed that out. Suddenly, we knew we had a situation. We were all pagans to an extent, so we tried everything. Sage, salt, rituals, sigils, and still, strange happenings. The kid's sleepwalking was getting worse. I remember the dreams now. I don't want to go with them. They want me to go, but I don't want to go. We thought it was a joke at first and told him, well, hell, kid, don't go. Tell them to go away. And then, excitedly, a while later, he said, I told them to go and to leave me alone, and I kicked their butts, and they left. Robbie, who are you talking about? The other kids. Right after he kicked their butts, the stuff started happening with the doors. Flashback forward. We know we have a haunting, and none of the usual stuff is working. I decide to go all in. I'm going to trance out, Edgar Cayce style, and see if I can maybe contact the other side. It worked. There was a lady there, and she had a message for me. I know you think this kind of stuff is a joke, but you need to know that it isn't. Robbie is in danger. He was raped as a toddler by his grandfather, and now his grandfather's spirit has come back to destroy his soul. He will turn the boy into a monster. You are all in danger if he succeeds. I woke up. People were watching me, the mom and dad. I didn't want to sound weird, so I asked. Kat, her but not a real name, was Robbie molested as a child? Her eyes got huge. Dad, who was really stepdad, looked at her confused. Well, people used to tell me that my mom would abuse him, but I thought they were talking. I caught her with her hand down his diaper one day, though, and flipped out, but I never told anybody. Stepdad looks at Kat. Is that why your mom isn't allowed to babysit him? The situation had actually been a point of bother, an inconvenience and source of several arguments between them in the last few months, when their work schedules had collided horribly. Kat grimaced. Yes. But it still didn't make any sense, because my vision said grandfather specifically. Unless... Kat, did your mom ever claim that her own father molested her? Her eyes almost popped out of her head when I asked. Yes, but... Did he ever babysit Robbie before he died? I knew her grandfather was dead. Her mother and her son were her only living relatives. No, he died before he was born. Still not making sense, but one more question. Did your mom ever claim that her father raped her? Kat was practically crying. These were family secrets, buried for years, coming from the mouth of somebody who certainly never had them told to him. Yes, but what does any of this have to do with haunting? The spirit in my dream last night told me that Robbie was molested as a baby by his grandfather, and that his grandfather's spirit was trying to corrupt Robbie's soul and turn him into a monster. If we go off of that, victimized children repeat this cycle by victimizing other children as adults. Then, in a sense, since your grandfather possibly molested your mom, and she likely did the same to him, then in a sense he started the cycle. He was the one who technically molested your son. His sin passed on to him. She was freaking out, full-blown panic attack, and the stepdad wasn't far behind. They both stood up alarmed. So what do? And we have to banish the old man's spirit and protect your sons. End the cycle, which we did with a series of specific pagan rituals. But that's my theory. The black-eyed kids were abused in real life, and then their souls were taken captive by the spirits of their tormentors to pass on torment to others, to feed off of happiness and replace it with pain and misery. If the Scandinavian tales are anything to go off of, and my own experience, I'm not going to say to invite them in, but perhaps a banishing ritual and warding charm could go a long way to preventing further harm. In mundane terms, I think those kids are already eternal slaves, but we should try to prevent harm in our own communities, watching out for abused kids, keeping harmful folks away from kids, taking certain nightmares and experiences seriously, and preventing what comes next. I think of all the mysteriously vanished people and kids who never turn up again, and I wonder... At first, I didn't think it could have been a black-eyed child, because I've never heard about them doing this before. My little brother, he's 6. He has some disabilities and disorders that cause him to be slow, not be able to hear properly, talk properly, use the potty properly, and he acts more like a toddler, but he's super smart, and he's my little man. One night, same as always, I was putting him to bed since I help out my parents, because I got 2 more siblings, and my mom works, so he usually goes to bed earlier, and I don't mind helping out with the kids. I was grabbing his blanket as he's babbling to himself. Not real words, but I still talk back as if he understood him. But all of a sudden, he goes quiet. So I turn to look at him, and I instantly feel a wave of complete terror and panic. Black-eyed children immediately flash in my mind, but then the thought is gone as I stare at him. He was looking at me, head tilting just a bit. His eyes were narrowed, and he had a tiny smirk on his face. He had never made this face before, nor have I felt so much fear by a face or him in general. I swallow the lump in my throat and say his name. As soon as his name leaves my lips, he shakes his head and face and goes back to babbling and looking at the bed within a couple of toys he had, as if nothing had happened. But the fear in that face didn't leave me at all that night, and I even felt uncomfortable being around him at that moment. But I told myself it was fine, and he's okay. And later that night, I told my parents. My mom thought he maybe had a seizure, but I immediately said no, because he hadn't had one in a few months now, and when he had seizures, he would fall wherever he is, get all tense, and is unresponsive for only a few seconds. And I knew this was not that. The next day, I texted my best friend because, at first, I thought he maybe had something in him, or something was in him. but I didn't think black-eyed child then. She told me to say prayers or something like that to find out, but she told me to be careful because if something was in him, it could be in my two other siblings. But I didn't think, so I said they didn't act any different like he did. So anyway, I go up to my room with my siblings because, I don't know, I felt better saying a prayer up there than anywhere else for some reason. Now, just to mention, we aren't Catholic, but we do believe in God, but our parents don't, so we don't say grace or prayers often together. Anyway, during the prayer, my two siblings, not my youngest, kept laughing and talking because, like I said, we don't say prayers often. After the prayer, I tell them to say Amen, and they do, but not my youngest. I look at him, and again that fear and panic come back, but not as intense as before. I again swallow the lump in my throat and tell him to say Amen. He again shakes his head, smiles, and says Amen. After that, we go downstairs again, and I sit down and start to text my friend, when I notice my brother fall over, staring at the stairs we had just come from, and he starts scratching the floor. At first, I thought he was having a seizure, since when I said his name, he was unresponsive, but then I see him scratching, and I knew it wasn't that because he doesn't move when he has seizures. I quickly get on my knees beside him and ask, "Are you okay?" And I say his name over and over as I try to pick him up, but he was so tensed up that I couldn't get him up. But then all of a sudden, he reacts by throwing his arms around my neck and jumping into my lap. His hold is tight, and he's still staring at the stairs, but nothing is there. I try to calm him down, but it takes a few good minutes until he's back to normal, and that was the last of anything this ever happened. I actually didn't think this was a black-eyed kid until my mom said something. I said I never hear any stories like this, but she said maybe this was the first, and then I thought this had happened before, but no one knew it was a black-eyed kid. She agreed and told me I should write it about, and then maybe I'll find out from other people who've had this experience before too. My life growing up was far from good. Rather than constant physical abuse, although there was that too, my parents ignored me most of the time. Both had drinking problems. My mom only worked part-time so she could, as she said, be there for her kid. But she really spent the majority of her free time in a bottle or bed. My dad was the main breadwinner, working as an over-the-road truck driver. He was away most of the time, leaving me alone to take care of myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. As long as I can remember, I was entranced by those woods. It wasn't long before I was spending my days exploring them. My love of nature only grew from there. I soon realized neither of my parents were paying attention to my comings and goings. So, I began camping out in the woods overnight, here and there, just to see if I'd be missed. But as I'd figured, I was not. From there, I began spending weeks at a time camping throughout the vast forest. We all know good things must end, and one morning, I was caught walking out of the woods by my father. He'd just arrived back from the time on the road. It was early, and he was livid to see his 12-year-old son walk out of the woods at 5 a.m. on a school day. In addition to hiding, I got an earful from both of them. This didn't stop me from returning though. After laying low around home for a week, I waited for my dad to leave and my mom to get drunk. When I was sure she was asleep, I fled back to my real home. I would slip back in early morning, every morning, prior to school without anybody noticing. It didn't take long for things to go back to the way they had been before. If I wasn't at school, I was roaming in the woods. I mentioned before I had a series of camps throughout the forest. Early on, I realized I was sharing my getaway with others. Among these interlopers were small groups of homeless people. Probably way before I came along, they'd use the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the public and police. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long on one occasion, and almost got assaulted because of it. After that run-in, I moved my camps to the other side of the river. Some nights, I would lurk in the shadows and watch them destroy themselves with drugs and alcohol. Many times, violence would break out, and this only reinforced my hate for them. I already saw enough of that at home, anyway. As the months passed, I moved deeper into the vast forest, always looking for a new place to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless. It wasn't long before they had their filthy little camps all over the woods. However, at that point, I was still safe if I stayed on my side. I was the only person who knew where to cross. River or not, my paradise would be taken away from me, once and for all by these very same people. One hot summer afternoon, I was down on the banks getting water. I had heard voices off in the distance, so was keeping my eyes peeled. I'd retrieved my water and was returning back to camp when I heard a group of people arguing on the opposite side. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a raggedy tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 female yelling at one another. They were far too away for me to make out much of what was said. They all looked like they were drunk, swaying around while they argued. I stayed around for about 10 minutes when one of the men hit another over the head with a big beer bottle. The man staggered and fell to the ground. I waited for the man on the ground to move, but he did not. The assailant then picked up a big rock and threw it down on the man while the others just stood by and watched. He did this over and over, about 3 times, until he looked too exhausted to continue. I had to stifle a scream as I watched this horror unfold, and by now, was too scared to move. The female then yelled something at the man and slapped him on the chest. He looked unfazed, and instead just stared down at the mess he'd just made. After a minute of doing this, the others yelled something again at him, and they all ran away together. I could finally breathe but still dared not move, in case they returned. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours before I decided that they weren't coming back. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but now I know how stupid that was. I got the crazy idea in my head that I needed to get him help. Drunk bum or not, he was still a human. I ran the entire 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was happy to see my father was home. I ran in short of breath and began yelling for my parents. I noticed them sitting together on the couch and ran up to them. My dad told me to shut up and then asked me what the matter was. I repeated the story of what I just witnessed in the woods. Rather than getting help, my dad began yelling at me about defying him. My slurring mom soon joined in, and they both commenced to chewing me a new hole. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up stories to get attention. I denied this, of course, but she was not listening. The rest went the way it always did. My dad pulled off his belt and strapped me across my butt until he began crying and told me to shut up, or he'd give me something to cry about. It was clear to me after the discussion was over. The man was not getting help. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I crawled off to my bedroom and cried myself to sleep, as I had done so many times. My retreats to the woods had ended. I couldn't even leave the house without one of my folks, and going outside was out of the question. Not long after that, I was shipped off to live with my mom's dad because I'd become too much for my parents to handle. I expected life to be much more as it had before, maybe even worse. After all, there had to be a reason why my mother was so messed up. I kept my guard up for a long time, waiting for the first beating to come. Instead, I would be given a life I could have never dreamed of. Grandfather Mac turned out to be a loving and patient man, the exact opposite of any adult I'd ever met before. The first time he asked me what I'd like to do, I was speechless. No one had ever cared to ask. I swallowed the knot in my throat and told him of my love for nature. Expecting the usual laughing and mockery, I braced, but instead his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me of all the great memories he had camping with his father. I knew then I had become the luckiest kid in the world. As soon as the springtime came, we spent every waking moment hiking the woods and parks throughout the country. The knowledge he passed on to me could fill up a library full of books. Even though he's gotten too old for us to go out together, I still visit him on a regular basis and share all the amazing adventures I have been through recently. His body may be weak, but his mind is still as strong as ever. I owe that man more than I'll ever be able to repay, and he did everything just because he loved me. It still took me a good 3 or 4 years until I summoned up the courage to tell him the story, Also, I expressed the guilt I felt for keeping it to myself all this time. I was unsure of how he'd react. At first, he sat there, quietly. A moment or two later, he sat up in his chair and hugged me tightly. This confused me, and when he let me go, I asked him what I should do. His advice to me was to contact the police back home and share the story with them. After that, the responsibility was out of my hands, and I didn't need to be guilty ever again. Once I contacted them, I washed my hands of the guilt, and now that I've grown up, I realize my parents were at fault. I did what I should have. If they chose to say nothing, it was on them. I went off to college, and upon my return at Christmas, Mac let me know that the people responsible had been found. Although all but the woman were dead, she shared the location of the man's body with detectives. They wanted to thank me for coming forward and helping them solve the case after all these years. With that, I moved on, leaving that terrible part of my life behind me. Until recently, with the death of my father, which seems to have dredged up all these old memories, I had not thought of that part of my life in some time. My love for the woods and its creatures has grown into my livelihood. Now, I get to travel all over, discovering and preserving the world's wild places before they are gone. Something I could have only dreamed of as a kid, trapped inside a rundown apartment in New Jersey, and without my grandfather's love, understanding, and teaching, none of it would have ever happened. When I was younger, I preferred to spend time at my great-grandmother's house rather than my own that I lived in with my grandmother. Being right next door, my grandmother would often let me spend the night with my great-grandparents to get me out of her hair. My grandparents had their own bedroom on one end of the house, and on the other end was the room in which I slept whenever I visited. This bedroom was big, to a 6 or 7-year-old, with a large bed that had sliding door cabinets for a headboard, and 2 large windows, one of which had a crate of older toys in it, mostly building blocks and the likes, that faced this side yard, which had several young pine trees. The other window faced the large barn out back and housed their camper and all manner of other things. Before I continue, I ought to mention that I'm a quarter Native American, of the Miami tribe to be specific. My mother was adopted by a family whose heritage was distinctly French. While my grandmother wanted my mother and I to have nothing to do with our heritage, my great-grandmother embraced it, never kept it from us, and even taught us a little bit about it. Me far less than my mother, since I was too young to understand, much before she passed. One night, when I was sleeping over at my great-grandmother's house, I woke up when the motion-detecting floodlight on the barn out back turned on. The room was flooded with light, and I could see everything clear as day. Unable to go back to sleep, I got up and decided to play with blocks until the floodlight went out and I could finally go back to sleep. For some reason, I felt the strange urge to look out the window into the side yard, so I climbed up on the crate under the window and peered out. There in the side yard was a young man. He was in his late teens, 17 to 19, with neatly cut straight black hair, nearly ear length. He wasn't dark-skinned, but he wasn't white either. He wore what looked like tan Carhartt overalls and appeared to be examining a young pine tree not 15 feet from the window. The tree wasn't very tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, but the young man was carefully moving the bottom branches this way, and that as if to looking for something. I watched him for a minute or two, simply observing. I didn't feel frightened, rather I was curious. Then, the young man lifted his head and looked around. When he saw me, the strangest thing happened. He looked startled, then terrified. His eyes widened so far that I could make out the whites in the low light. There is no other way to explain what occurred after, other than the crazy sounding. He turned into a deer and bolted away into the darkness. He simply turned to his left, made a drop to all fours, and was a deer by the time what would have been his hands hit the ground. He ran off back beyond the barn. I don't remember the conversation I had with my great-grandmother about it in the morning, only that she seemed upset and was tight-lipped, and that she and my great-grandfather went out to look at the tree later in the day. They didn't find anything, and my grandmother didn't want to hear about it, so I shrugged it off. Years later, I would learn what skinwalkers are. I would think back to this young man, and how he could have been native, how his coveralls could have been deerskin. I would also think about my experience and it didn't line up with other skinwalker encounters. I didn't feel any fear. I didn't notice a stench. No one called my name. Also, the young man seemed to be afraid of me. Then again, I suppose if I was looking for something and I saw a small child staring at me out a window, I'd be a little freaked out too. As time went on, I had, for the most part, convinced myself that I had just happened to witness a teen boy hunting illegally on our property, and my startling him startled the deer he was after, and my child brain just processed it strangely. That is, until I decided to bring up the concept of skinwalkers with my mother. I had told her that I could have possibly seen one when I was a child if my memory could be trusted. When she said, "Oh, so you saw the Birdman too, huh?" My belief that I misremembered a teen boy hunting had shattered. She wouldn't say much about it when I seemed confused, simply stating, "Oh, there was an old bald man who would dance around on the roof with his belt made of feathers, and when I would go out there to yell at him for being so loud, he'd smile at me and fly off as a bird." That house was on land that was tribal before the family. I was adopted and moved into the area several generations ago. Artifacts coming to the surface every other time the big field behind my childhood home was plowed. Many others have had experiences there, including others of my own, though most of the other experiences seemed surreal, seemed to be things that could be brushed off as a coincidence, or me psyching myself up to see or believe something that wasn't there. But that young man who turned into a deer sticks with me, and has led me to be distrusting of deer. And not just because they're a road hazard. I have had many other strange occurrences with deer since then, but none so unbelievable as the shapeshifter in the coveralls. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by the day's end, we'd plan the destination and date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck nor Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors has never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer, perhaps the most important of all goods. We'd loaded up and were ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we have no idea of what lay ahead of us, and how it would affect our connection to one another. A connection we once believed to be unbreakable. 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how the dry surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, wasn't my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn put the knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos to use setting up the tent. I had purposefully got the easiest tent I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd become obnoxious and loud when we got drunk. More importantly, I liked to make big bonfires and turn up my music loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. Despite the hangover, I resolved then and there it was something we were going to do much more often. When I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. This made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed an armful of wood. When I returned, I set it down on the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly, and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then, I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open, and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mass of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a nice cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything we could keep, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after, we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire. It would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we had left for home. Most of the night, the three of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 a.m, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going out to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his bag. He eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to piss like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other two up. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell, similar to burned meat, hit me. I figured one or both of the guys were already up and burning our breakfast. I looked behind me, and only Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark for him. I looked up, expecting to see my brother burning food, but was met with a sight far more serious and horrible than I could have ever imagined. The fire was burned out, and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up, within a few steps, and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then all of a sudden, it hit me what I was seeing. Chuck was lying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was the black and smell the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he did not answer immediately, I ran into the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but I yelled, "Chuck's dead," loudly in his face. He jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point toward the manor and the remnants of the fire, and the horrible vision that the sun was making clear by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him and silently with my eyes closed. Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrid smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when I first realized I had pissed myself. It didn't matter though. With every second, the sight became more clear, and I was too terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what had happened. They arrived about half an hour later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned up the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to one of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back to the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent. We talked about the trip and the events of the night before. Nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later when the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from the terrible smell of my brother's burning flesh. Looking back on it, I acknowledge I may have been a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of the family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate to another how to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling my mom was as bad as I imagined. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when Mom found them. Boys their age are usually hard to adopt out, but Mom had fallen in love with them at first sight. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was on her. This was the first instance I began getting the feeling Glenn harbored suspicions towards me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his usual questioning look, many times throughout that month. As months had passed, more and more questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention. I had always assumed that Chuck had passed out or tripped and fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much more drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance. Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured, a worrying sign for sure, but even the doctor was forced to admit things like this happen in a fire. The skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason, they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I try to show him this is the wrong time to be apart, he's convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations towards Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. More than once, I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. Do I have my own suspicions? Yes, but now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us now more than ever, right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break her heart, it might just kill her. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for our mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers, and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields some terrible truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother, too. I met my best friend Ben when I was 19. We started a degree in music together and had absolutely nothing in common, which we loved about each other. What shocked us was how in sync our childhoods had been. From being born 2 weeks apart to the age of 12, we shared a lot of experiences even though we never met. I remember Ben telling me about a VHS he used to have with cartoons on it, saying how obscure it was and how I'd love it. I replied that I knew exactly which VHS he was referring to, and also still had a copy of it. This sort of thing happened a lot between us, so we liked to quiz each other from time to time, and then joke about how different we were for our identical upbringings. One night, when I was staying over at Ben's house, we got on the topic of kids' ghost stories. I love creepy stories, but Ben hates them. So, the conversation was slow going at first. We started with the usual stories kids in the neighborhood spread. It was funny how many of our town's stories were exactly the same for being opposite sides of the city and river, 10 miles from each other. The dilapidated places were always haunted. We both had heard about a one-eyed black cat nobody owns that watches the children who play out. The list of stories went on, and so did the similarities. Ben, surprisingly, into the discussion. So, you've ever heard of this story? Etc., to which I confirmed or told my town's slightly different version of the story. That's how the night progressed. After we exhausted the conversation, he ended with, "Even to this day, I'm scared of the Dogman, so please tell me you've heard that story too." I just remember being dumbfounded, saying I had no idea what a Dogman was. As far as I'm aware, the Dogman story is just in Ben's town. We tried looking on the internet, but Ben was too easily freaked out by the pictures and scary stories that popped up as we searched. The Dogman really grabbed my attention. Usually kids' ghost stories get into so much detail, like the color of the ghost's dress, or the exact way the hair hangs over the ghost's eyes. but there wasn't much info about Dogman. The details were vague. His words at the time were something like, "The older kids who were allowed out the street told us about Dogman, who stood around in the alleys at night, and the older kids were shamelessly scared to go there when it got dark." Obviously, it was thugs or druggies, I explained. But he was adamant. No, because they ran away when they noticed the kids watching them. They'd climb up the high walls of the back alley into people's backyards really fast, without making any noise. The older kids wouldn't talk about it unless pushed. He said their feelings seemed too real to make it to a joke to scare the younger kids. His childhood friend Wes claimed to have saw one too. The story goes that the Dogman would be found standing in the small groups and more solitary in the middle of an alley, looking for scraps of food, not doing much else. Ben seriously thinks he saw one with his mom one day walking back from shopping. Apparently, it was in a fenced-off area where a block of flats had been demolished just a few years prior. At the opposite side of this land, he saw a skinny, hunchbacked man cupping his hands full of water from a stream which ran through the plot, washing his long, greasy hair, almost ritualistically. Even though he didn't see the homeless man's face and was quite far away to make out details, he swears something about the man wasn't quite human. I blamed a child's imagination and exaggerated memories, but he swears it. He showed me the area that next morning. If he and his mother are remembering correctly, I have no idea why even a homeless man would wash his hair in that dirty stream. I first met Wes a few weeks after that night that I learned about the Dogman, and didn't hesitate to ask for his first-hand account of the Dogman. It was the main reason I decided to meet him, after all. His description was similar to Ben's, but his encounter was far more close up. Wes lived from the local corner shop than Ben and used to take a shortcut through an alley when he walked there. The wheelie Ben's route that day, he said he could hear a cat or dog fending on some discarded food behind one of the bins. It happens a lot, and everybody knows to keep a distance so the dog won't get aggravated and attack. But Wes said the dog didn't look right. He only got a quick glance before it ran behind a wall with a rotten roast chicken hanging from its mouth. According to his memory, it was running more like a hyena than a normal dog, with its shoulders held much higher than its hips. The snout was too short, and the ears were more elven than a dog's. He can't remember if the creature had fur or not, but it definitely was naked. Not long after, he overheard the older kids talking about Dogman and realized what he had saw. I like Wes. He has a doubting attitude akin to mine, and admitted his memory may have been influenced by the older kids' stories. It could have just been a normal dog struggling to carry a whole chicken away after being startled. The story lay dormant, not mentioned for months after I spoke to Wes. In that time, I had moved away and have only managed to visit Ben 3 times since then. The last time I met with him, we decided to go to the local takeaway in the early hours of the morning, and I got my very own encounter of what could have been the Dogman. Right on that same abandoned plot where Ben saw the homeless man bathing, there was a decent-sized fire burning. I could make out possibly 3 silhouettes huddled around the flames. Ben's area is pretty rough, so this isn't an unusual sight, but I don't know how to describe it. Those figures weren't moving naturally. My view wasn't great because Ben wouldn't move closer than we were, but I swear those silhouettes never stood completely upright. We watched them for about 5 minutes. They were hunched over with their backs up, warning and warming their gloves and hands by the fire with their hoods up. I remember one of them moving closer to the fire while keeping its hands on the ground. It would have been easier to just stand and walk closer, but it shuffled awkwardly using its arms. Everything about their movement was indescribably awkward. I was so excited. It had to have been the Dogman. I didn't want them to spot us, so we left pretty soon after that. But I forced Ben to visit the bonfire with me the next day. There was just a milk crate that sat next to a charred circle on the ground. Nothing to prove these beings were inhuman. Strangely, there were bones in amongst the smoldering papers and branches that had been burning the night before. We could make out scooty handprints where at least one of the homeless people had presumably crawled over to the charred ground. The trail of handprints led away from the bonfire and faded after a couple of meters. That was all we found. We walked away feeling slightly silly, laughing at how we had probably been stalking a trio of drunk tramps. However, Ben's realization unnerved us terribly. As the handshell faded, he pointed out a large paw print becoming more and more prominent in the middle of the fading handprints. Then, it struck me why I found their gait so weird the night before. As the man had walked closer to the fire, he placed his feet in exactly the same spot where his hands had been. We stared in shock, not sure what to make of the trail. Then the yelps and growls of the dogs fighting came from a bush uncomfortably close to us. I'm not ashamed to say we ran away crapping ourselves. Maybe it was just a pack of dogs. We didn't care to look, and I'm never going back there to find out. This is the craziest UFO phenomena true story, and it came from my dad. 1960s in Ethiopia. My dad is just a child, 9 years old at the time, playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was Minister of Interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple of hours pass. His parents, my dad's parents, and guards are searching, but no Gabriel. 48 hours pass. Now, there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid. It's on the news. Police are searching door to door, describing him and what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing at his private school uniform, white shirt and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him. Still, nothing. A month passed, then 2, then 4. People start losing hope that he would ever be found, and think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day that he disappeared, Gabriel appears back in my father's backyard. He was still wearing the same white shirt, private school uniform, and it was clean. He looked exactly the same as he did when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they had confirmed that he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple of nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men who looked like white guys could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying, even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and cars were flying around him. He said there was people, but they looked really strange. Like us, but different. One nice man was still with him and took him to a tall building, where he said he had to stay there for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said that he could push a button and the room itself goes places. An open field, the beach, the room itself even flied. He said after a couple of hours he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was the only one gone for a couple of hours total. No one believed him. In Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel even was forced to see a priest and get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics, and I believe he currently works in Holland. This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m., and we drove 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing ones a little closer, but he swore I'd love it when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again and not paying attention to where I was going. We arrived at a flat section and I was relieved. My friend was in the front row and somehow missed the trap, but I did not. All I remember was that 1 second. I was camping and clomping along and hitting the ground the next. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked out most of the pain. As I stood up, my right leg buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharpened stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there were several more stakes in the bottom of a hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bones sticking out of my skin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I already was. I looked up to get an idea of where I was, and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend, only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at the moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped, and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug some type of bear trap, and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me with the tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious. I wasn't getting out of the hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't very concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above and freaking out. So I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to go get help. The ranger station was only a little over a half an hour back from where we came. He could easily get help and make it back to me with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy me. By now, it was coming in waves, and the accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed the wise decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually, it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while, that is, until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay, until I began to notice the hole filling with water. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up, and I could relax. The water level was only about halfway at my shins, and I knew now, if I continued at that rate, help would be here before it even reached my waist. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. The only positive about the whole thing was it had taken my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest in my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time, the ropes pulled me out. The water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in a little hole, out in the middle of nowhere, still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital went by fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive. Broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I may give my friend a ring. We haven't seen one another in a few years, and a camping trip might be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. I'm not sure if this counts as an alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago and have been dying to tell the story. About 5 years ago, me and 2 other friends were on our way back from Warped Tour in Maryland. For those that don't know, Warped Tour is a heavy metal / hardcore concert tour thing. We were being driven by one of our friends' moms because none of us had a car that we could drive yet. It was almost night. The sun was still out, kind of, and it wasn't dark yet, and we were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road, and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes, and everyone in the car was screaming our heads off. Not because it was a look out for the deer situation, but because this was the scariest looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long, gangly limbs, and moppy black stringy hair. This thing moved so weird, I can see it clearly to this day. It even galloped so awkwardly, did not run on all fours like a deer, or anything of that sort. When it jumped off the back 2 legs and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down, and then galloped across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing, which was, what was that thing? To this day, I am convinced it was a demon, or an alien, or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly, that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times and years after the fact, and it still gives everybody shivers. The argument started the same way every time. You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I liked it that way. Old school was kind of a description of how we camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it new-fangled junk. My mother tried on multiple occasions to introduce things as common now as nylon tents, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather carry that big, musty walled tent everywhere we camped. And don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked all over everything. He was certainly a man born too late. The term roughing it had too been coined with him in mind. We'd continue to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my father would drag us out to the national forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for the time of year, and the forest beautiful. I could still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with the hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing my dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight. Me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it might be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let 2 young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the 2 of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, and then go back out until supper. We'd been doing this as long as I can, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflage clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had been just a few days prior, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree, and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly, followed by a whistling going by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called to Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over, and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to trick me or was in real trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle and listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction, about 20 yards, and stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike. I knew it had to be Mike. I ran to the bush he was lying under. The sight I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already had been. Had I been older, I may have known better to move him, but I just reached down and scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow, I held myself together and ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my father. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me, and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed toward where I'd set him down at, and he took off. By the time I'd caught up, Dad was already picking him up and heading for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, Mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had given him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More than shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctor gave us the news. Things had been touch and go for a long time. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during the surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now the urgency of the situation had passed. I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my father considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mother, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as of late as the day Mike was discharged, no names had been connected to the case. The most widely held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the lack of red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this happened, and sadly, won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate cases, though. 34 years have passed since then, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery, and went on to start his own business and family, just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of their mess. We never returned to the National Forest, and even better, Dad decided with all those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Between 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This was the way I'd always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me. We were camped along Marble Creek at Donkey Creek near Avery, Idaho, July 2019. It was a weekday, so no other campers were within miles. Deep mountain valleys and dense woods. I was chopping food for dinner. My husband and small children were fishing at the loud creek. I'm an avid birder, obsessed. I must know every call I hear. And that evening, I heard a call that sounded like an old-fashioned crank police siren. It was echoing through the valley and came from a higher altitude. Howls of the same timbre and pitch, but slightly varying length. I thought it was an owl. I must not know. Wolves and cougar don't sound like that. My dog did not bark. She hid under the table. I also considered that maybe some kids were playing with an old police siren. But then I realized there was no way kids could have been up there near the ridge with something that heavy. Plus, no one else was up there. When I got back into cell reception, I searched through owl calls and found nothing similar. But I found that call on other Bigfoot websites. It was the Ohio Howl. Whenever my husband works midnights, I can't sleep, so I came outside to sit on my steps and smoke a cigarette. I happened to look up because the dogs were barking at something. I looked up and saw this tall black figure standing and kind of peeking out from behind the shed. I looked at it and kind of squinted at it to see what I could see, and it really wasn't moving. I went back inside my house and grabbed the gun. When I came back out, it was gone. I don't know what he was doing there. It was just a big tall black mass peeking out from behind the shed. It was massive. It was big. I jumped up and ran inside to get the gun. I was able to see its head, part of the shoulder, and some of the knee. It was leaning out. It was 7 foot tall, but it was sort of hunched over too. There is no lighting back there, only in the front of the house. We have a tree line that comes up behind our place. The tree line comes with about 100 feet of the house. I don't know how many times I've been here by myself and heard something bang on the shed in the back. There were a couple of nights that I went out there with my gun, but every time I've heard a bang like something is hitting on it, and the door had been left open. I don't know if something was trying to get in there. I know it's not the door banging because the door is on a track to hold it still. There's been other times by the camper shell I've heard noises. I've run inside and get the big light and shine it over there, but nothing there. There are a lot of unusual noises that I've heard over the years here and there, and I've never been able to put to what it was. There are several times when I have walked back to check the noises at the shed where I felt something was watching me. I've also gotten that feeling a lot at my French doors because I don't have anything over them. I'll be sitting on my couch and feel like someone is looking through that window, and I'll look up and there's nothing there. And when I get this feeling, I am home by myself. I have an apple orchard in the back, but of course, this time of year, there aren't any apples. But late last year, a lot of the apples were gone. My husband picks up all the bad ones and throws them out into the field. I got to thinking about this because somebody found a footprint recently between Bunker Hill and Staunton. A few years back, I was really into caving, or to give it its dumb name that nobody uses, spelunking. I really did not think I'd be into it when I first tried it. Like, I'd have considered myself mildly claustrophobic, the kind of guy who always felt a little anxious zipping up a sleeping bag up the whole way. But I don't know whether it just woke something up in me, or it was the rush of getting over fear of something to that effect. But I took to it like a duck to water. You're somewhere you shouldn't be, exploring parts of the world that very few people see, relying on people, truly relying on them, to ensure your safety and theirs. It's a rush, that's for certain, but it's not without its dangers. So, every year, my family and a few close friends head out to a national park or something along those lines to spend some time with nature. And one particular year, I managed to convince them out to Mammoth Cave National Park over in Kentucky, which is home to more than 400 miles of passageways, making it the world's largest known cave system. The cave system is located within the Green River Valley, and its winding chambers, pools, and limestone labyrinths are equal parts beautiful as they are eerie. 10 different tours offer guests the opportunity to explore the decorated, historic, and dripstone areas. The cave complex is especially well known for its natural entrance and Gothic avenue, a passageway filled with historic stone monuments and signatures from 19th century visitors. So, that was just about enough history and photo ops for my mom and aunts. The river could provide hours of fishing for my dad and uncles, all while myself and my cousin could enjoy the caving there. All went well with the vacation, right up until the second to last day, when my cousin and I decided to get a little too explorative during a visit to the caves. My cousin was fairly new to caving, so for the first few days, we didn't go too deep or too far. Last thing I wanted to do was freak him out before we'd done anything worth writing home about. But as the week drew to a close, there was no way I was going home without finding something a little more extreme to traverse. So, as we're heading back to civilization, after an afternoons of caving, we found a slit just less than knee-high in the rock wall of a cavern. You had to get down on your stomach to fit into such a tight squeeze, but if you did, it led to a small crawl space that cut through the entire rock. After a few meters, I noticed that quartz was growing on the passageway ceiling, and in the light of our headlamps, they glittered in a way that I can't really describe in words. I mean, it's like something out of a fairy tale. A still from one of those weird Jim Henson movies. It's just magical. So, we entered one at a time, given that the tunnel was only wide enough for one person. The old claustrophobic me would have thought this place was a living nightmare. For real, I'd have straight up panic attacks and probably have died of a heart attack before deprivation ever set in. Every single time you took a breath in some places, you'd feel the ceiling of the tunnel on your back. It was that narrow. But the new me just found it thrilling. Once you get into your head that these things can't just up and collapse on you, you get this feeling of calm, and then one of exhilaration when you realized you were conquering your fears and going places other men dared to tread. The deeper inside the tunnel we went, the more incredible the scenery became. It was like a whole other tiny world, tucked away with solid rock. But eventually, like most small subterranean tunnels, it just kind of petered out. At one turn where there was a dead end, the other was host to all kinds of stalactites and stalagmites. Those are like those rock spike things you see, usually on the roofs of caves, only you get them on the bottom too in most places. I'm checking out the stalls to see if there's a possibility of us twisting through them to get to the deeper sections of the tunnel, when I hear my cousin whisper something behind me, something that honestly made my blood run cold. He said he could feel water on his back. Something was dripping on him. As it turns out, while everyone was having a good time outside, checking out the statues and whatnot, it had started to rain. Only they neglected to tell us, so thanks guys. It's also worth noting that the tunnel we were in had sank down into the rock for a little while before sort of flattening out at the bottom. And to save you all a little geology lecture, I'll get to the point. The tunnel we were in was filling up with water. Granted, it was filling up slowly, but the position we were in meant that only a few inches of water could effectively drown us, and that's a real bad position to be in if you don't own a pair of gills. Needless to say, we turned around as fast as we could, which took the longest time when you factor in how narrow the tunnel was. Then began the long, slow crawl back along the flat part of the tunnel. It was absolutely horrific. I tried to keep calm as I collected as I could, but hearing my cousin almost cracking up in front of me is something that still makes me shudder to think about. My biggest fear was that he'd just lock up, which scared people are prone to during particularly grueling caving sessions. For some reason, the brain just decides it doesn't want to take the body any further, and that's that. They can be stuck down in the rocks for hours before they're calm enough to keep going. I was terrified. He'd just lock up, not move, and be the reason we both drowned there, dying while our family laughed and joked in their tents. But he didn't. That magnificent fool kept his cool, relatively speaking anyway, and just pushed on. That doesn't mean it still didn't get pretty close. It was horrendous feeling the water slowly rising around us, seeing the little drops turn into trickles, each new one causing my heart rate to speed up and my adrenaline to surge. By the time the tunnel started to turn upward, back towards the main entrance, the water was almost to my lips. moving made these splashing noises, and both of our sets of clothes were completely soaked through. That little incident caused a ton of crap for the remaining 2 days. My aunt and uncle blamed me for almost getting my cousin killed, and they pretty much took it out on my parents for allowing me such a dumb hobby. We didn't go back into those caves at all, and to be honest, it took me a few months before I even thought about caving again. It hasn't put me off entirely, and I think it did me some good to become a little more safety conscious. But you can bet your butt that I check the weather before caving now, every single time. And if it even looks like it's going to rain, don't do it. It's just not worth losing your life over, no matter how amazing it is. Okay, so this story isn't quite from a cave, but it is from underground, so I suppose that's fairly similar. So, at my old high school, there were these maintenance tunnels that snaked for hundreds of meters underneath the building itself. They were the newly built ones, and then there were the old ones that the school did not use anymore. My friend Katie and I found an entrance to the old tunnels in a classroom that had long since been abandoned. We had to bust the lock on the old trapdoor, unscrew a round metal top layer, and lower ourselves into a square, dirty tunnel. The main tunnels were about 2 feet wide by maybe only 6 feet tall, with maybe a few inches of dirty, stagnant water flooding the bottom. Now, these tunnels were very dark and very cold, with the utterly disgusting stench of stagnant water and old mold. It was gross, but we began exploring the tunnels a little more every day. One time, we were in there for maybe 20 minutes tops when Katie almost passed out from the smell. At least, that's what I thought it was. Turns out there were some dangerous gases down there. What I found out later were methane sinks that were actually pretty dangerous to those without safety equipment. I had to pretty much drag her out. But the next time, we brought respiratory masks, waterproof footwear, and flashlights, then set about mapping out pretty much the entire system. All in all, we mapped out more than 700 feet of twisting, turning tunnels. It became something of an underground lair for us. They went up, down, and turned to the sides, so much so that we had to use chalk to mark the walls so we can find our way back. After a particularly long expedition, maybe like 3 hours, we headed back to where we came in, only to find the opening was actually locked. We pushed and turned on the metal cover, becoming fairly frightened when we found out it wouldn't budge. We were basically trapped inside, and realizing that did not feel good at all. We rushed through the tunnels, trying to open each of the 3 openings we had found over time, but not a single one of them would open. Any panic that had been simmering away before had now bubbled to the surface, and to say the least, we were completely freaked out. We ended up rushing down a tunnel we hadn't exactly been down before, hoping it would lead us to an exit. After a while, I kept hearing noises behind us. I told Katie, who was crawling in front of me. We froze, turned off our flashlight, and listened. Sure enough, a steady splashing sound was actually following us. We freaked out and started to make a run for it. Please bear in mind, we had absolutely no idea where we were going at this point. It was just pure blind panic. After what felt like an hour of frenzied dashing through the tunnels, tripping over pipes, and scraping our knees, we emerged into a bigger room. We realized it wasn't a room, but sort of a down section of a much bigger room. As it turned out, there was somebody doing maintenance down there with us. We hid behind some old metal stairs, and when the guy left for more tools, we scrambled up the stairs, out the door, and hid in the girls' locker room for the rest of the day. We never did find out who locked us down there, or what that splashing noise was, but you can bet we never went into those tunnels ever again. It was last year, 2019, around mid-October, near the Blue Ridge Parkway. Me and my boyfriend were working for the Roanoke Times, delivering newspaper when this encounter happened. We delivered anywhere from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. We were almost done with the route when we went to turn down this dead-end maintenance road, since there was houses at the end of that who got paper. It was around 3:30 to 4 a.m. While my boyfriend was going down the gravel and maintenance road, the headlights caught a glimpse of this thing standing right at where the grass met the road. It stood about 7 feet tall, and it took off up the hill. It kinda walked fast, not necessarily ran. It was dark brown and had shaggy hair like fur. It was on 2 feet and walked like a human with its arms swaying back and forth, right below the knees. I screamed out for my boyfriend to stop the car, but by the time his reaction time kicked in, whatever it was already made its way up the hill. My boyfriend positioned the car so the lights would shine up the hill, and that's when we saw 2 bright glowing red-yellow eyes looking back at us. What was strange was it was hiding behind a huge tree and how high the eyes were up from the ground. It was close to 7 feet tall. You could clearly see the eyes blink. We sat there for approximately 10 minutes and finally decided to finish up the route and come back. We did eventually come back after we got done with the last house, and it was gone. But you could see where the tree limbs and grass was pushed down from where it was standing on the side of the road. Maybe less than a month before we had the encounter, we had heard tree knocks while on our route from deep down in the woods, maybe a neighborhood or 2 over. It scared us so bad when we heard it that we just bagged the newspaper up and threw it on the side of the road. Some backstory. My mom and I are both firm believers in all things paranormal. We know the stories of black-eyed children very well. 2 kids with no emotion and black shadowy faces asking to come inside to use the phone, grab something to eat, or even ask you for just simple help. But if you help, bad things will happen. We are believers, but of course, we never thought either of us would actually encounter something like this. On Friday night, my mom got home late from work. There was a meeting about her work staying open during quarantine, so she didn't get to her house until around, I think about 7:30 or so. After pulling up in front of our house, she noticed a kid walking down our street. Now, my neighborhood doesn't really have younger kids at all, mainly just as teenagers, so my mom found this kid walking kind of strange. She even says to my dad, who was on the phone with her, and he jokes about the kid jumping on her car to scare her. You know, a typical dad trying to be funny. Sorta. Then just as fast as he was in front of her and moving to her, he was gone down the road and around the corner. 20 minutes go by, and before my mother hangs up the phone and steps out of the car, from behind her, she hears a very childlike, "Excuse me." After dropping her purse and screaming, she looks to the kid who notices it's the same boy who had disappeared around the corner almost a half hour before. Immediately, she told us she had this overwhelming feeling of pure fear throughout her entire body. She stares this boy down and notes that she can't see his face at all because of his hood and shadows from the street lamp behind him, and he has no shoes. It's 8 p.m. on a Friday night, after a stay-at-home order was just put out, and there was a little boy running around barefoot and just shorts and a hoodie. It was like he was trying to dress like a regular person, but just barely missed the mark. This little boy with his head down asked my mom if she had seen another little boy, and that he couldn't find him anywhere, meaning he was one of a pair. My mom, who has 3 kids and is one of the most genuinely kind people I know, had no urge whatsoever to help this child in front of her, or had any kind of sympathy for his situation. She just felt wrong, like there was something off and she needed to leave. In her head, her only thought was that she needed to run to our porch steps and get inside. However, what came out of her mouth was completely different. She tells this little boy, "No, I haven't, honey. Where did you lose him? I can help you look." Every part of her was telling her to leave and that this was wrong, but she offered to help. It's like the children knew that she thought something was off, though, because right at that second, another boy in the distance screamed. Of course, my mom jumped and her fear spiked, but the boy was eerily calm still. He looked at her and in a monotone voice said, "Oh, there he is," turned in the opposite direction and ran up our street and then turned left, which was the wrong way where the voice came from. When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting and fixing and stuff, as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just from the UFOs and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other, so my mom chased us off and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out at night fishing with our father. The stars were amazing, looking without the city's lights pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed out to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there's no such constellation, yet here it was. While we were looking at it, the stars took off differently and silently in different directions and vanished all over the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone. But we were spooked, and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where my mother was sleeping. About half the way there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we get back into the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when we tried to talk about it, my dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stories. My sister asked, "Why did you run?" And he said that he was tired and wanted to go to bed. He was tired, so he ran? My dad can be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s, and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Never did see the purple glowing mist though, and we looked for it. It was around the year 1989. I was working at McDonald's in Carlinville, and I was closed that night. I was headed home around 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. I was headed west on Illinois Highway 108. I was going through an area on the highway known to the locals as Hagaman Bottoms. Just as I was about to approach the bridge at the bottom of Bell Hill, I saw a large creature standing next to the road. Just as I got near it, or just about even with the creature, it reached out at my car. It scared me, and I accelerated my car to get away from it. It was very bright, moonlit night, and I could tell that it was dark brown, or black in color. It was also tall, as it stood above the top of my car. The car I owned at the time was a Chevy Celebrity Eurosport. I remember it standing facing east when I was passing it. It turned south and reached out with its right hand. This was a very scary experience for a young girl in a car, going home, all by herself. As a child, I grew up in a small town named Fayette. This town is just west of Hagaman Bottoms. At night after the supper meal, we would take food scraps out to the trash burning barrel behind the shed. I would get a feeling like there was always something around, or close by, and my hair would stand up on my arms, and I would get very scared to go out there when it was dark. I never did see anything, but just got an eerie feeling, like something was watching me. On October 7th, 2017, my wife, myself, and our dog went on a late-season kayak paddle to Upper Priest Lake and overnight camping trip at Beaver Creek Campground. After loading the kayak after our paddle, we drove half a mile to the campground, only to find that it was closed for the season. Not wanting to find another campsite, we drove around the campground to Toole Bay Boat Launch parking area, which was still open. We parked our vehicle, unloaded our tent, sleeping and cooking gear, and began to set up camp, carrying things into a designated site that would normally be accessed by the campground road. I was a bit concerned about camping in the site, after the campground was officially closed, but figured that it was already getting dark. It was unlikely that we would be confronted by a ranger. It had been raining and was getting cold, and my wife wanted a campfire to warm up our paddle to Upper Priest Lake. I didn't want to start a fire, as I was still uneasy about camping there and concerned that a fire would attract attention to us. After setting up the tent and getting things situated, we heard a who call to the north of us, across the road. I had the distinct impression that it wasn't an owl, but a person wooing for somebody in the dark woods, like someone trying to contact a hiker who was late getting back to the car, though there were no other cars in the area. The call was quite loud, louder than any owl I have ever heard. To me, it seemed like it was coming from something, a person with very large lung capacity. By this time it was dark, and we couldn't see anything beneath the tree canopy outside of our campsite. While my wife worked on starting a fire with wet branches, unsuccessfully, I arranged our sleeping gear in the tent. Suddenly, we heard a woo call that was much closer and much louder. This call made us nervous, as we both felt it was made by a person who was camping around our campsite in the dark, messing with us. But we had heard no vehicles drive in, saw no headlights or flashlights, and it was too dark and overcast for a person to drive or walk around the woods without a light. My wife has better hearing than I do, and heard what she felt was an answering who from some distance away in the forest. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked 75 feet or so back to our vehicle to get my 9mm pistol. There was no question that this was not an owl. The call was much too loud and gave both of us a fearful feeling. I could feel the loudness of the call in my chest. We noticed that our dog had no reaction to the calls, remaining in camp and not acting scared, but I sure felt that way, even with a firearm on my hip. After the last loud call, we didn't hear anything more the rest of the night. No vehicles drove into the boat launch parking area, and we heard no people or animals about. In the morning, I looked around our campsite, but couldn't see that anything had been disturbed. Later back home, my wife researched owl calls online, but couldn't find anything that sounded like what we had heard. Whatever had made those calls around our campsite that night knew we were there and had a lung capacity much larger than an adult human male. Last fall, 2019, while on a motorcycle ride up Tango Creek, which was approximately 15 miles from our incident, we saw a fir tree, about 5 feet in diameter, broken off about the 8 to 9 foot tall off the ground, near a trail by a pull-out parking area. No other trees in the area had been damaged. I'm a qualified caving instructor, and honestly, it's not very often at all that I actually get frightened during a caving trip. Now, it's entirely possible that I've never gotten spooked because I'm simply not claustrophobic, nor am I afraid of the dark. I mean, asking somebody who likes caving to describe really scary moments in a cave could, but if you asked people who hate caving, but were somehow roped into it anyway, what was scary about it, those stories might prove a little more fruitful. Having said that, there's definitely a few caving trips I presided over that haven't gone exactly according to plan. I used to do a lot of solo caving, and rappelling down vertical caves was one of my favorite parts of the whole process. I must have dropped into a cave maybe 300 times or more. Last month, I took a small group of Boy Scouts from Michigan into a vertical cave. Being slightly out of practice and not trusting of my own well-worn gear to keep the kids safe, I ended up borrowing one from a buddy of mine. It was a slightly smaller bundle, slightly narrower in diameter, but it was infinitely more flexible than mine was. I thought this might prove to be more boon, but it turns out I didn't quite think this through, and problems that didn't occur at me at the time began to manifest quickly. Once I was in the cave, I figured out pretty quickly that I didn't have nearly the amount of control I was used to when rappelling. I found that I was able to stop, but only barely, sitting over a 200-foot drop while hardly being able to keep myself from sliding. I decided to abort the rappel at the first ledge I arrived at, which was about 30 feet down. I had to lock off my rack, and call on those who came with me to help me swing over to the ledge and climb back out. Imagine that, having your life in the hands of a bunch of Boy Scouts. No offense to the little guys. They did the job, but I was pretty worried for a minute or two. I did have climbing gear with me, and I suppose I could have just switched over to the other rack, but that would have been a hell of a lot more trouble, so I took the easy way out. No, not that one. Since I was able to lock off the rack, I could simply rest there and think about my situation, and the thoughts were not good. The Boy Scouts had their troop leader with them, so it wasn't like there wasn't a strong, full adult there to add some extra pull. But I'll admit that I couldn't help imagine what would happen if something went wrong. If I were the panicking type, I suppose I would have been deathly afraid that I would lose my life, right then and there. But that doesn't mean the prospect didn't make me feel extremely nervous. I was literally dangling, like 30 foot down into a pit, with gear that was not right for the rope I was on, with absolutely no way to control my descent. The thing is, I'm careful enough that when I decided that the rappel wasn't a sure thing, I chose to call it all entirely, rather than risk that I had enough control to descend safely. That's the type of care that keeps you alive in caves like that. But if you want to hear about something that really has that pucker factor, that's about how a vertical cave with pull downs, you take your rope with you, and an unexpected increase in water levels. There's a cave out in Tennessee where there are 3 vertical drops over 100 feet, but people typically only take one rope, because the bottom of the cave is open, and you could pretty much walk out of it, unless it's flooded. There is always water in the cave, anywhere from ankle deep to about 18 inches. Between the second and the third drop, there is a long 400-foot crawl way with low ceilings and high water levels. When I've been, there is about a half a foot of water, with about the same amount of airspace above. It's a really nice crawl though, with pretty river pebbles on the floor, and lots of small, put-clean formations along the walls, white calcite formations, and stalactites and stalagmites, and soda straws mostly. Some of the formations are beige, yellow, or tinged with red, showing impurities, of course, which leads to lots of variations during the 400-foot crawl. If, for example, a caver was in a small party who were exploring this particular cave and dropped into an expecting typical through trip, but happened to have a problem during the second 200-foot rappel, the party could just decide to float him through the crawlway and lower him down the final 100-foot rappel. They could pull down the rope and move him to where the entrance to the crawl is, only to discover that the water levels are too high, and there is a very small air gap in the crawl. But with the water that high, the movement of the water would be very swift, and it might be too much for somebody attempting to navigate it to fight their way back upstream. That person would have to contend with just a few inches of oxygenated air at the top of a passage that has razor-sharp rocks all along the cave ceiling, and at the end of the passage, the water jets out over to a drop that's more than almost half a mile down. The immense water pressure would try to push them out of the passage, and it would take a great amount of strength and effort for a sustained period of time to be able to resist the water pressure. And honestly, it would not take long to exhaust somebody, and when they run out of strength, then it's time for the big sleep. It's likely that the fall would not kill the caver outright, since the bottom of the drop would be completely flooded. He'd hit the bottom, and in all likelihood, break a bone or sprain an ankle, but the water would essentially break his fall, potentially saving his life. But that's only assuming that he could breathe the whole way down the passage without getting his face torn up by rocks on the ceiling, and as you can imagine, that's very, very unlikely. If there's one thing you take away from this dumb story about caving, it's that you never go alone, and generally speaking, you don't try to take an injured person out of the cave with small numbers. It's better to leave one person with that injured party and let 2 people go out and get help. That's why the smallest safe party is no less than about 4 people. But with one person staying back and 2 people trying to make it out of a flooded passage, there's potential for lots of drama. Let me preface this by stating that almost all of the encounters that I have witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first 2 encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days a year and a half ago. I do not recall being abducted. I have filed reports with an incredibly incompetent mutual UFO network. Back in '97, my buddy and I had just finished up our pizza shift at a joint. It was around 11 p.m. We were worn out and wanted to go get stoned. We were completely sober. Anyway, we drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about half a mile off the road. It was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed when I notice what I believe to be a truck headlight shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic. I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I'm messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brickweed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds, this star starts moving up and down, side to side, and in circles. I yelled in a panic, "What is that?" My buddy just gives a dismissive sigh, and then he looks where I'm pointing. For 5 minutes, the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and do so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some kind of formation, and other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as they came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving too much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time, the one object turned into at least 7 objects. The way they moved and jerked around felt aggressive to me. My friend must have felt the same way, because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go. Embarrassed, I confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul out of there, and this thing follows us to the outskirts of town. The night after, me and the same buddy walked across my apartment complex to go visit with a neighbor that was about to grill some burgers. The sun was just starting to set on a humid midsummer afternoon. We knock on the door, and my neighbor lets us sit in. With him was his girlfriend, her sister, and some random guy that I didn't know. I go out back with Ray to chit-chat while he fires up his Kingsford grill. It's just the two of us, so I take the opportunity to tell him about the previous night. The stars are just starting to come out, and in my storytelling, I pointed out one just so Ray would know exactly what I meant. I'm still pretty much tripped out, so I'm fairly excited when describing everything. I'm almost done with my story, and I notice Ray looking at the stars that are just beginning to appear. I mean, this guy is looking around everywhere. It's like he became instantly paranoid. While I was in mid-sentence, Ray points to the northeast and yells, "Like that right there?" The goosebumps. He yelled inside for everybody to come out. They did so, and soon after, the same situation as mentioned starts to occur. It went on for a bit. It went on so long that everybody but Ray and myself went inside. We ate our burgers while watching this. Behind Ray's apartment was a field. 300 yards away on the other side of the field is a tree line and creek. On the other side of that tree line is another field. This object slowly descends towards the tree line, and I open the door and yell for everybody to come back out. We watch this huge fiery orb in complete silence land on the other side of that tree line. When we lost direct sight of it, we could still see the light through the trees. Right before the light disappeared, it became very bright. We all kept asking each other if this was real. And this is the part where some of you may lose it, but hell. After several minutes and at the end of all sunlight, nothing was happening. Everybody was in and out of the house. I remember standing in the front of the back door, talking to Ray's girlfriend in the kitchen. Ray, my buddy from the previous night, and the girlfriend's sister were outside. My buddy says, under his breath and darts past me. The sister is right behind him. Ray shoves me in the door and almost falls on top of me. The girlfriend screams, slams the door shut, and locks it. We all back away from the door, all after our "what on earth was that?" We decided it was a four-legged, covered in brown fur and tried to attack us. This apartment was a townhouse. We all went upstairs to get a better look. There it was, in the shadows. It was pacing around and keeping an eye out. This is when they appeared. They came out of the darkness. They were short at around 3 feet tall. Skin tone was grayish with a bit of Caucasian color. These were short grays, and there were several of them. Meanwhile, the animal thing starts to climb a utility pole. This isn't a typical utility pole. It has 6 or 8 transformers on it, and is H-shaped and kind of low. When the beast starts to climb, I watch it shapeshift to a degree. It decides to perch on one of the crossbeams. It looked right at us, but its focus seemed to be on the ETs. It acted like a guard dog, for lack of better words. The Greys were clothed, and they had some sort of instruments. They seemed preoccupied by the field. They would look at us on occasion, but they were doing something. What exactly, I don't know. This went on for hours, and eventually, we all went and ran back downstairs. Every once in a while, I would go check to see if they were gone, and as soon as it was all clear, I ran home. That was it. For the next 4 years, I pretty much believed it was random. And then after meeting my biological father for the very first time, my ex-wife jokingly brings up my UFO stories over dinner and wine. I have had several experiences over the years near my home. 5 years ago, I was picking blackberries on the back side of my property, late June. To the east of the blackberry vines is a farm field. The field was planted in corn, and there was a strip of last year's corn residue at the edge of the field. Old stubble, hard to walk through with boots on. There were a series of footprints coming out of the field, moving towards the woods. There were 5 prints, about my size, men's 11 or 12, barefoot, wide with no arch, flat-footed. I go barefoot a lot, but no one in their right mind walks through a cornfield with stubble and barefoot. 4 years ago, my son and I were in my bedroom, watching videos on my computer, about 6 in the evening, when something passed by my cabin and beat on the wall as it went by. Scared us to death. The pounding started near the corner of the room where we were in, near the ceiling. This is a good 10 feet above the ground level outside. The second was in the other corner of the room. The third hit sounded like it came from above the window in the den, and the fourth and fifth hits were on the bathroom wall. Quick, bam, 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 bam. I live in a log cabin, and it literally shook the house. Next morning, I looked around outside. No prints, nothing on the logs. It was in July and August. Ground was dry and hard. I have ruled the house settling, small animals, birds. No idea what it was. This year, May to June 2012, about 10:30 at night, I was getting ready for bed. My son was in the bathroom. We both heard a low, very guttural grunt. "Who?" outside the house. My son is 18, and large, muscular young man, but he came out of the bathroom, pulling up his jeans and looking scared. We ran out onto the porch in time to see something large, dark, and low to the ground run past my neighbor's house. Truthfully, it looked like a gorilla, running flat on all fours. It activated my neighbor's motion sensor lights in front of his home, and about 30 seconds later, the coyotes on the other side of the highway went nuts. It was moving, 1/4 of a mile in just under a minute. The next day, my father said he also heard the grunt. It woke him up. I sometimes find broken trees and bent trees in the woods. I have also heard screams and howls that I can't just write off as being a deer, bobcat, coyote, or vixen. I don't know where I stand on the whole UFO controversy, but I can vividly recall an experience from my childhood that I've never forgotten and cannot explain. I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. I distinctly remember it because it caused me a sense of terror, more pure than any I had had or felt since. My parents' house is out in the country, and my old bedroom is on the second floor, with 2 windows facing north and west respectively. My bed was up against the west wall, just beneath the window. My dog Henry was sleeping with me that night. I woke up to the sound of Henry barking and found my room bathed in light from the window above my bed. I can vividly recall Henry silhouetted, staring into the light, barking her brains out. I jerked up and looked out, but there was only light. A crackly, humming, droning sound filled the air. I was disoriented and terrified, both for myself and for my dog, but all I could do was pull my blankets over my head and curl into a ball. I was sure Henry was going to die. I remember feeling sorry that I was too frightened to help. In my head, the clear thought of, "I don't want to die," repeated over and over, and I wasn't aware that it was the first time in my life that I had ever really not wanted to die. Like, it was the first time I'd ever genuinely felt that I was going to die. The experience ends there. I woke up the next morning with Henry in my bed. I immediately went to my parents' room and woke them up to ask if they had seen the light or heard Henry barking, but they hadn't. I wondered if I dreamt it, but I'd never had a dream so visceral before. All the fear I'd experienced up to that point became a lower classification. Now there was fear, and there was real fear. When I first heard about sleep paralysis, my mind immediately went to that night. It had some of the same characteristics, the terror, the vividness, the weird noise. But I wasn't paralyzed. I moved twice. Once when I sat up and peeked into the light, again when I pulled my blankets over my head and hid. I think I can give a good answer to this, as I have been caving as a hobby for several years now. Nothing really supernaturally creepy ever happened during any of my cave events, but I have been in some dangerous situations which have either left me questioning my sanity or the sanity of those around me. So I used to go caving with a group of people from a university club, but I had been out of the university a few years and just been doing my own thing. Well, one weekend, me and my friend Josie decided we should go on a little trip to a cave with these guys, to see how the old club was doing. The club that taught us how to cave, and we in turn taught the new guys when we were the old breed. So, anyway, the trip is going according to plan, and me and Josie go off caving on our own. But one evening, we decide to join the whole group and cave with them in a tunnel system near our communal campsite. Now, at the time, it was raining a little, and I was beginning to feel uneasy about the whole thing. But to be honest, I never voiced my concerns and just went with it. Big mistake. And so it was that a large group of us, about 12 people, arrive at this cave system, spending about 20 minutes checking their gear before entry. The particular cave system we were exploring is normally just a subterranean river on the inside, but it has a few levels of corridors that you can explore, high above the water itself. The entrance is really tight, though, and requires you to climb down this tight pipe extremely cautiously, using only your feet to feel for stable footholds. There is absolutely no way to see what is below you, and basically, if you lose your footing, there is a nasty fall that could leave you seriously injured if you fell victim to it. However, manage to keep your head together, and you'll be fine. So much of caving is winning the battle in your own mind. So, we get to the cave and the guys in the club are doing their own thing. Me and Josie are just the old, salty veterans coming along to relive the old college days. Once we're inside, we realize that there is one younger girl who's got herself somehow stuck in the entrance at the very rear of the group. Turns out, it was only her second caving trip ever, and for some reason, her buddies thought it would be a good idea to bring her into this one, even though she had panicked whilst in a much larger, easier cave system earlier in the week. So, one of the team leaders stays behind to help the panicking girl calm down and get her to advance further into the cave, while the rest of us move deeper down some of the long corridors before we start exploring the cave properly. Then, I went and asked one of the leaders of the group, a girl I had taught how to cave just a few years before, what time it was. And to my absolute shock and horror, she straight up tells me she doesn't know, because she's not wearing a watch. Shocked, I asked her how the hell she expects to know what time to leave the cave and to be out for call-out. For those that don't know, the call-out is arguably the most important aspect of serious caving. It's where you let someone on the surface know, even if it's just a friend who's not even on the trip, exactly who is going to be present on a caving trip, as well as what time you plan on leaving. Without a call-out, if something goes wrong, nobody will know you are missing for days or even weeks, and will then have potentially hundreds of caves to look over in the hopes of finding you. And in that time, it's entirely possible that you could have died of deprivation by that point. Remember, it takes just around 72 hours without water for a person's heart to just pack up and cease beating. Anyway, the leader of all these sweet innocent beginners tells me that she did not leave a call-out, or bring any first aid kit or safety equipment. I'm literally furious that she's put us in this situation, but I hold my cool long enough because I don't want the others to panic, because to panic in a cave system is a straight-up death sentence on occasion. But still, I tell her quietly that I am now the call-out, and tope out the cave by 1:30 p.m. I reluctantly give her my watch, trying not to start and snap and straight up call her reckless and dumb before I start back towards the cave entrance. Back near the entranceway, the other leader guy who was sitting with the girl who got stuck earlier, the same one who managed to get her into the cave, turns out she just could not handle it, and they'd abandoned the attempt entirely. I go through the situation with them and tell them I am leaving the cave to be the call-out guy. They ask me to go get an SRT kit, which is basically just ropes and a harness, in case any other caving club needed to climb back up. So, I do just that. A little while later, I head back with the gear, which they did not have at all, and I had to borrow off other cavers who were lucky at the campsite. I get back to the cave, and the others are leaving, rather slowly as it is a difficult entrance, and climbing out is considerably harder than climbing in. They all manage to get out, but lo and behold, the panicking girl gets stuck. And with two leaders trapped below her, she is blocking the entrance. We harness her up, and I rig up an anchor to try and secure her on a rope in case she falls, but she is wedged in there tight, and isn't in the right frame of mind to get moving. Then, I get the news from the others below that the cave is starting to fill because of the rain. And after what seems like an eternity of them nicely talking to this panicking girl, telling her she's doing great and she will be fine, she is getting worse at this stage. I freak out. I shout at her that she needs to get herself together and get out of the cave because two others are stuck behind her. It kind of works, and she nearly stops having a panic attack. Not entirely, but stops hyperventilating, which just makes her more stuck. She still won't climb out though, so against all common sense, I'd lie down into the hole and grab her by the harness and pull her up and out of the cave. This actually occurred last week on January 15th, 2016. I live in outer Sunset in San Francisco. Around 7 p.m., I poked my head out the window to see if it was raining. It wasn't. I heard a loud aircraft overhead, which was several magnitudes louder than the planes that normally fly in the area. I looked to my left and saw a plane that appeared to be a commercial aircraft, but I noticed it was much larger, and the lights were super bright and creating large cones of light ahead of it. I remember thinking how neat it looked, being able to see so much of the craft and the area lit up around it with such a cloudy evening. When I tried to focus in on its lights, they flickered off, and I lost it completely. I could still hear it though, very loudly. About 10 seconds went by, and I see something come alight about 2 blocks to my right. I see a lot of commercial aircraft out there, but this was easily 4 to 6 times larger in the sky than they normally appear. The lights were strange too. I saw what appeared to be 4 white jet exhausts, and across the whole craft, there were blue and red lights in lines slowly glimmering. It moved much slower than regular planes, and was visible for about 10 seconds moving north along the beach, and then vanished for about 10 seconds. Confused, I looked around to see if anybody else had witnessed it. Lo and behold, Someone on the corner of my street who was riding their bike had stopped and was gazing up at the sky in the same location as the craft had been. I shouted down to them, "Hey, did you see that? What was that?" They turned and looked at me, looked back at the sky, and then back at me. Then, without saying anything, got on their bike and rode away quickly. I could still hear the craft, so I got out onto my roof, and about a half-minute later or so, I saw it come again from behind and slowly fly west out over the ocean until it vanished. I stayed on my roof watching and waiting to catch it again, but I didn't hear or see it. After about 20 minutes, regular aircraft began flying overhead per usual. My best guess is it could have been some sort of The past several months, we have had some very strange activity going on around our house. We live out in the country, and we've ignored a lot of it. But, here lately, we can't ignore the activity going on. About a month or two ago, my husband went outside to smoke, and he heard something, and as he looked in our driveway, he seen an animal that stood about 7 feet tall, all hairy. He couldn't explain it, except that it looked like one of our dogs on 2 feet, and extremely tall. It walked past our trailer, and that's how he could guess that the height could be. We've heard what sounded like a baseball bat hitting a tree. We've heard whistles and calls of what Bigfoot sounds like. We've had chickens and cats go missing. Every night, about the same time, you can hear footsteps and sounds. It's to the point to where we are scared to go outside. We've never believed in Bigfoot till we've seen it, and have heard them. I'm sure there are more than one around, because we live near caves. They sound like they are all around us at night. We had a ball in our yard, and after finding it in the woods one day, and down the road from us another day, and bring it back several times, it went missing, and we've not been able to find it since. I just find it odd that this has just happened after we've been hearing noises that sounded like Bigfoot. I'm a 24-year-old male, living in the Philippines. This is not even my story, but my dad's. It happened when I was a year old, and my mother was pregnant with my younger sister. We lived in a semi-rural area, where we had a lot of relatives, and everybody knew each other in the neighborhood. My dad was out watering the plants in the backyard, when he noticed a huge black bird perched on a low branch in a tree we used to have in our backyard. I know, big deal, right? Except the bird had unnaturally bloodshot eyes, and looked back at my dad like it was thinking. My father, a bit unsettled, thought nothing more of it as he resumed his work and went inside afterwards. Hours passed and it was after dark. My dad went out again to do some more chores in our backyard. He was just finishing up when he noticed, in the alley between our house and the fence separating us from the neighbors, some small creature shuffling across a puddle of water on the pavement. Now we had a pet turtle, a red-eared slider, and my dad thought that the turtle somehow got out of its tank and was making its way across the alley. But on closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't our turtle, but, I kid you not, a crab. That's right, a crab, hundreds of miles away from any sea. It was huge, a dinner plate-sized crab. And what further unnerved my father was that this crab, just like the bird earlier in the morning, bloodshot eyes. The crab stopped to look at my dad with, according to him, the same intense stare the bird gave him. My dad, having had enough, quickly went inside, a bit creeped out at everything that had happened that day. The very next day, my father was speaking with the elders in the neighborhood at what he saw the previous day. They told him it was an aswang. Now, in rural areas of the Philippines, there are stories of aswangs, which are a kind of Philippine analog to vampire in Western folklore. They are said to be shapeshifters who enjoy feasting on human and animal entrails, but a favorite delicacy of aswangs are unborn fetuses. An aswang would crawl atop a roof at night, directly above a pregnant woman as she slept, slip its long tongue through an opening in the roof, and lap up the fetus like a mosquito would blood. As it happened, my mother was pregnant with my sister. One old man claimed he knew the aswang that paid a visit to our home. He told my dad that this particular one wasn't trying to eat my sister, but that it just liked being around pregnant women. Like my mom because it was intoxicating to all ass swangs. Doesn't make it less creepy though, and I'm glad that that ass swang was not one of the malevolent ones. It was an interesting story though. I should pay more visits to my dad to hear more stories from him. But I haven't gone back to them since, because their foolishness straight up nearly got 2 team leaders killed. I have recently moved out of my house in Illinois. During the last year or so, I have experienced several strange occurrences. I have never actually seen anything, except once a large dark shape moving bipedally through the heavy fog. I have heard the sound of something drumming on tree trunks, the sound of something big walking in the woods on 2 legs. I have found chunks of firewood thrown from my woodpile, and on November 25th of 2008, as I was packing to move, I heard a moaning howl very close to the house. I have hunted for 20 years, and I have never heard the likes of this. I stopped loading the vehicle, loaded my .45 and locked the door. I did the rest of my packing, and the next 2 nights, armed but as before, I had the distinct feeling I was being watched, and several times large branches were broken and there was knocking on trees. Also, there is an area of woods where the grass and foliage is crushed down. This could be deer, but since these things have started occurring, the deer, who are usually thick as fleas, have been gone. Several other people have heard knocking. However, I was alone when the howl occurred, and it is mostly at night. I live in Wisconsin and have been interested in Sasquatch my entire life. I have been a hunter for 44 years and know sounds, footprints, and behavior of just about every creature in Wisconsin. I have always wanted to become involved in actively looking for Sasquatch. In 2015, I started researching sightings and incidents in Wisconsin and discovered the northern third of the state had many reports in Phillips, Prentiss, and Price counties, as well as the national forests. My husband is also interested, so we decided to research areas of some reported sightings. We spent a great deal of time walking around the forest off of Highway 17 near Winter, Wisconsin. We documented our findings using video cams and photographs. I have a photo of what I believe is a Sasquatch print in the forest near some tree bends and a small ground glyph that was about 5 yards from the print. A year later, we discovered that the glyph had been modified with additional sticks and limbs. We have photographs of tree bends and breaks and trees woven together that no human could manage, and since 2015, have actively returned to the same area of the forest to see if there are no changes or anything new. I have also had a response to a wood knock that I did in the summer of 2018. The area of the return knock is in the area that has no homes, roads, or trails. Beginning in 2016, my oldest sister, my daughter, and I decided to set up camp near Loretta, and each summer we would spend time camped and actively researching and have many photographs. On June 6th through 9th, 2019, we once again set up our camp in the same campground, but in a different site that we had not used before. At the end of the row, on the southwest side of the camp, there is nothing for miles behind that spot. We did not see anything unusual when we hiked through the forest earlier in the day, but on our last night, a bear walked through our campsite just before dark, so we decided to hit the bunks early. It was around 10 to 10:30 p.m. when I heard a rustling around the camper. It's a modified camper with a deck that has a zipper tent extending from the camper with a tarp material around the bottom. The creature was crinkling and fiddling around with the bottom portion of the extended porch and making the tarp crackle. I thought the bear had returned and was rustling around camp and expected the camp to be destroyed, and the next morning. The noise went on for about a half an hour and then it stopped. My daughter and sister were asleep. Less than 30 minutes later, a handful of rocks hit the side of the camper, followed by 3 more rounds of rocks, and finally, a larger rock hit the camper roof. This woke my sister, who sleeps with earplugs. She later says she does not know why she woke up, but I believe it was the sound of the big rock hitting above her head. By then, my daughter was awake as well. It was quiet the rest of the night. The next morning when it was light out, I bailed out of the camper, expecting to see a ripped-up camp, but all was pristine. The first morning at camp, my daughter set up a hammock behind and slightly to the side of the back of the camper. When she was taking it down, she found a rock in the hammock. My theory is that whatever threw rocks had to lob them over her hammock, and one either bounced back and fell into the hammock or pinged off the tree and landed in the hammock. We were the only campers in the campground, except for a man that came in with his rig. He left the next morning. Many areas have tree bends, twists, a possible footprint, all in the forest just east and north of the campground where the rock throwing incident occurred. Back in the spring of 1978, at the age of 17, myself and my high school sweetheart were parking just off of a seldom traveled country road in a county about 10 to 13 miles south of Carlinville and roughly 10 miles west of Gillespie. We were making out on a farm field across in the back seat of my car, parked about 20 feet off the road. The area was fertile, bottom land, just about 50 feet from a bridge over a small creek. There were dense woods around with a small cornfield, maybe 4 acres cut out of the fertile soil alongside of the creek. The night was one I'll never forget. In our young passion, a foul stench came over the area, but the real thrill soon followed. We heard the loudest, most shrill scream we could imagine. It was very, very close and extremely loud. It started as several low-toned grunts and exploded into the most frightening shrill scream I'd ever heard. It seemed to vibrate the old car we were in. We were both panic-stricken and scared out of our minds. I jumped into the front seat, butt naked, and drove like hell until we were on high ground and away from any woods. I hadn't taken time to dress until we were miles away from that spot. We discussed what had happened and decided to keep the whole thing a secret. Actually, we looked at each other and said something like, "This didn't happen, did it?" The whole thing gave me a fear of the woods that lasted for almost 20 years. But as I looked back on it, I realized whatever it was had been watching us, and at any time, if it were a savage beast, had every chance to do whatever it wanted to do to us. Did we go back later and look for the tracks? No. No way. I avoided that area at all cost, day or night. Did the sound resemble recordings that we hear of Bigfoot? Well, actually it did indeed, but amplified by 100-fold. I recall as small children the screams of what the local Illinois farmers called a mountain lion. We had several cattle maimed, and that scream was nothing like the one we had heard that evening. It was just so chilling. Mine happened probably back in about 95 to 96-ish. At the time, I was a pizza delivery guy. I was out on a delivery, and after the delivery, I was returning to the store. While driving along the highway, I noticed 3 still lights, almost in a row, way off above the horizon, since it was evening and it was dark. Stars were visible. First thought was that they were from planes for the airport, as they were way brighter than the stars that were out. They only looked still because I was driving on the highway, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the course of the next few minutes, as I was continuing down the highway, I noticed the center light started moving up. It continued into the shape of a triangle. I continued to try and keep an eye on triangle of lights in the distance as the whole thing moved towards the sky. I eventually lost eyesight of this thing, behind trees and whatever else, and made it back to work. I was utterly confused by the whole thing. I didn't tell anyone because I figured they'd think I was crazy. I kind of even thought myself I was saying things and making things up. I don't know why I remembered this part. All of this happened about a week before the Super Bowl. Might have been the Friday before Super Bowl. I'm unsure. All I remember is that before the Super Bowl, I was watching Sci-Fi Channel. Some show was on about people who had seen UFOs, whatever. I was always skeptical. Then, they did a segment on numerous sites of triangle-shaped lights, and they started showing clips of the few examples that people had caught on video. It was exactly what I had seen. Never saw anything since. No one else reported any strange sights or lights that weekend that I knew of. Of course, I was a dumb kid in my early 20s, so I didn't pay attention to local news. But I'll never forget that incident. Me and two friends were walking up to the gas pipeline to fish a natural spring on the mountain, now privately owned by a hunting and fishing club. As we crested our first hill, all three of us stopped at the same time. We saw a Bigfoot about 200 feet up the pipeline. I would estimate it to be about 7 feet tall, brown and very shaggy. After about 30 seconds, it ran into the woodline. It covered about 30 feet in 3 strides and disappeared. As we got to where it was, you could see 4 spots where the tall grass was pushed down from its steps. My friend says Bigfoot threw rocks at him in the 70s about 5 miles away. I live in Greenville, Texas, north of town, just off of Highway 69 North. I have lived here 12 years and have had strange things going on at my house since I moved here. But in the last 2 to 3 years, things have really started happening more. I live down a dirt road off of Highway 69. There are a lot of woods around me. Also have several neighbors around me too. And in late summer of 2017, I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud banging on my house. I knew I wasn't dreaming because I shot straight up. And at that exact moment, my 2 little dogs flew off my bed barking and carrying on. I stumbled into the kitchen, wondering what could be happening, and it was 2:38 a.m. My 2 big dogs outside were not barking, which I thought was odd. To make a long story short, I called the sheriff's department. 2 deputies came out and found nothing. From that moment on, every 2 or 3 months, I have several incidents for a week or 2, then nothing for another month or 2 or 3. Then things will happen again. This past winter, from November 2019 to February 2020, I've had several things happen. On 3 separate occasions, while I've been propped in bed watching TV, I have heard a loud growl outside my bedroom, loud enough to hear over the TV. It was loud and guttural. I have had tapping on the back of my house during the night. It's usually always around the same time of night. In January of 2020, I was once again propped up in my bed watching TV, and over my TV, I heard something rubbing on the back of my house, on the wall where my bathroom is. My bedroom and bathroom run together. My 2 little dogs jumped off the bed into the bathroom at the back wall, barking. I've had rocks thrown at my house. I'm home alone most of the time, but this past Saturday night, April 18th, 2020, my husband happened to be home. Between 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., my dog starts barking and wouldn't stop, so I get up to holler as to her to hush. As I got to my bedroom door, my cat was lying in my rocking chair next to my door. I paused to pet her, and about that time, I heard that same loud guttural growl at my back door. My cat heard it, wheeled around, and looked at the back door. I went and woke up my husband. He looked out at the back and saw nothing. I went to the front door and opened it, and he called my dog. She would not get close to the fence and was barking, looking towards the back of my house, towards my neighbor's home, behind me. All of a sudden, she jumped back, like whatever it was coming towards her. I ran to my guest room to look out the window facing that direction, and back towards northwest. I saw something huge and dark in color going across my neighbor's back pasture, moving fast. My neighbor behind me lives alone, and she has had the same things happen at her house. I saw a UFO up close, probably from 30 feet away, tops. I'm pretty certain that it was of military design though. I was out driving with my younger brother near a military base in Tucson, Arizona, probably not even 2 miles from my house. It was about 10 p.m. or so, and there were no cars on the road. I was making a left at an intersection, and right as I completed my turn, I heard it. Approaching from behind us was this vrrr sound. Literally, the sound that they play as an effect for hovercrafts in movies. That was what I was hearing. It started out quiet, but got louder as the craft got closer. Since it was obviously heading above us, my brother leaned out the window and exclaimed, "What is that?" To which I responded by hitting the brakes. What I saw shocked me and had convinced me ever since. As I came to a stop, the craft glided above us, and I watched the wings detach like a transformer robot and lower themselves from the craft by about 10 feet. The wings at this point were supported only by 2 rods connected to the craft. There were 2 giant thrusters on each wing, as well as an even larger one at the bottom of the main body of the craft. The shape of the movement suggested that it was in some sort of VTOL mode. Because it changed into this mode, it swung around and did a complete 180 over a 2-story building just ahead of us to our left, barely missing the roof with its wings. Then it reconnected the wings, forming a triangle shape, and it boosted off back over our heads at an incredible speed. To further describe the craft, it had 2 modes as far as we could tell. One, where the craft is consolidated into a triangular shape and seems to be designed for quick horizontal travel, while the other mode allowed for VTOL movements. It could switch between modes like 5 seconds or less in this mode. It almost looked like the body of a stealth bomber, but with 2 sword-shaped objects underneath, and of course with thrusters facing like a 45-degree angle, but they seemed adjustable. The whole thing was pitch black, and we would have never noticed it had we hadn't had the radio off and heard it approaching from behind. I can come back later with a I was with a friend of mine behind his grandmother's house. We had seen some dead fish near a pond, broke in half, so we went back later that day to look to see what might have caused it. We went about 100 yards in the woods when my friend had to go use the bathroom, so he walked away from me when I heard a noise off to my right. I looked and see something looking around a tree about 50 to 75 yards away. I could make out on fur of the outline of the shape. It looked like it was about 8 feet tall. I seen it take a step, and then I took off running back to the house. I was the only one that seen it. He just noticed me running back to the house. He was using the bathroom. The crazy thing about this is I don't in any way believe in UFOs, even after having the experience, though I have no good explanation of what happened. I'm a pretty staunch atheist, and I don't tend to believe in something unless there's a reason to. I don't even trust my own experience, even if it was corroborated by others. But this one was really hard to shake off. I was riding home through the country one evening, rural Kansas, and had 3 other friends of mine in the vehicle with me. We were totally sober, because I feel like that matters, and we were about 20 miles or so outside of town on a country road in the middle of nowhere. It was about 11:30 at night, late enough that there really wasn't any other traffic on the road, but not so late that it was in the middle of the night or anything. I was in the back passenger seat, looking out the windows just into this dark farmer's field that has just a tree line that paralleled the road. All of a sudden, just behind that tree line, it's about 100 yards from us, I see blue lights flashing behind the tree line, and I turn towards my friend who's driving and tell him to slow down. We pull over to the side of the road and look out towards the tree line. At this point, the lights are directly perpendicular to our position on the road, but we were behind the tree line. At first, I'm thinking it's like an electrical substation blowing up or something. But then the blue lights change and start flashing in all kinds of different colors, becoming more and more rhythmic and bright, casting God rays through the dust over the tops of the trees. At this point, I had stepped out of the car and was watching as the God rays began to descend towards the eye level. Whatever it was behind the tree line was rising up towards the tops of the trees. At that point, my friend starts screaming for us to go. We jump back in the vehicle, and he takes off like a bat out of hell, flying down the road. The lights continue to rise until they were perfectly level with the treetops, and whatever was on my other side starts chasing the car, staying just out of clear view behind the other side of the tree line. My buddy pegged the car out over 90. It was a family car, and not very fast, and the thing kept perfectly alongside of us almost the entire way back to town, and then winked out just before we got there. We talked about it for an hour at a gas station just inside of town, and then decided that we wanted to go back and see if we can find whatever it was we had seen, but this time took dirt roads that paralleled the country road. So, we'd been on the other side of the tree line. When we got back out there, we saw fire trucks all over the place driving slowly with spotlights aimed at the field, looking for something. They were canvassing a large area covering about 3 miles. I called the fire department to ask them about it the next day, and they said they had gotten reports of lights or fires from several people over a large area, but they were unable to find anything. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. I was having a small campfire last night alone with my small dog, who at the time was sleeping. First, there was something moving through the wooded area to my left. Sounded like it was on 2 feet and moving towards some neighbors' houses. I wasn't alarmed by this, although it was dark and there were no flashlight. The neighbors do walk through there from time to time. My dog was not alerted at all. This part of the incident may just be coincidental, but it's what happened next that I'm curious about. About 5 to 10 minutes later, to the left of me, way off in the distance, there was an obvious wood knock. Then immediately to the right of me, in the distance, but in the direction is the Great Croton Swamp, was a reply wood knock, and then immediately after that, another from the left. Then nothing. I've never heard anything like that before. It was about 11 p.m., and the neighborhood was quiet, and in my opinion it was an obvious call and response. Are wood knocks usually so instantaneous, or do they usually have some time in between? I've told this one before, but it's definitely worth a retelling, especially if I include a bit more detail. A long time ago, I happened to be on a visit to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico with my 2 college buddies. So, this one particular small cave we decided to explore began with a narrow 15-meter belly crawl. At the opening, there was a buttload of cobwebs spread across the cave entrance, but they seemed to clear up after a few feet. Pretty creepy, but generally nothing to worry about. Although I really hate that feeling of them when they touch your face, and there are a few dead flies in there or whatever. Anyway, I was the most experienced caver, so I went first and did the belly crawl pretty quickly, pretty much making myself the human shield for these big clumps of old cobwebs. As the tunnel ended, I came out in a small domed room, about 1.5 meters tall, and about 4 or 5 meters across. I had some time before my friends made it, so I was describing the room to them while dusting the spiderwebs from my clothes. I looked up at the ceiling and gasped a bit. I'm not afraid of spiders, but the sheer volume of them caught me off guard. It must have been a minimum of like 1,000, all crawling around each other. Now that I think about it, it was probably more like 2,000 or 3,000, all hanging from the ceiling with egg sacs all around them. I mean, they were a legion, like there wasn't a speck of rock ceiling to be seen, as the entire thing was just a mass of 8-legged crawlies. Hey guys, there's a lot of spiders hanging from the ceiling. Don't stand up when you get here, I called to them. My friends were considerably more cautious of the spiders and began to ask a few questions. How big are they? What color are they? How many? What kind? They're not that big. They kind of look like black widows, but they're not. They're the wrong color. They're brown. The legs look a little lighter than the body, I said, studying them as best I could with my headlamp. I was no spider expert, but I knew a black widow when I saw one. But then, a friend of mine, who was a big animal expert at the time, and actually went on to be a Wisconsin DNR warden, yelled out, "Really? Do they have a small pattern on their back, sort of like a violin?" Yes, I replied, already getting a really bad feeling in my gut. Our buddy, the DNR warden, burst into the room, looked up, shuddered, then forced himself to look at one of the spiders as close as he could manage. The color in his face drained out, and he hissed, "Get out! Everyone get out of the cave!" He didn't say any more. He just rushed to get out of the cave as quickly as he could. It took us all about 10 or 15 minutes to get into the room, and it took us about 2 whole minutes to get all the way out of the cave. When we finally got out, the other 2 of us were confused. My warden friend told us that what we were looking at was a nest of brown recluse spiders, some of the more poisonous arachnids on the entire continent, and we had been unlucky enough to stumble across their lair. When they bite you, you go through excruciating pain for a few days, skin necrosis, and then possibly die. We didn't go in any more caves with cobwebs in them for the rest of the trip. I have had 2 incidents in the last few months. The first happened one morning when I woke up early and had to use the restroom. On the way back to bed, I looked out the back door to see the sunrise and check if the dog was in the backyard. I watched a large dark person or thing cross the field from one tree line to another. The second happened on the night of the meteor shower, just a few weeks ago. I walked outside to look up and watch the shower. I stood there for several minutes before I looked down. Directly on the other side of the fence was a large form. After I screamed my head off, it bolted to the tree line. It may be completely unrelated, but our dogs have been bringing home several bones from different animals on a semi-weekly basis,